The sea remembers everything, and here, where the waves meet the edge of an ancient world, the water holds stories that shimmer just beneath the surface, stories of a people who built their lives between the mountains and the endless blue, who painted their walls with dolphins leaping through impossible waves, who carved their names into history without ever knowing that history would one day call them lost. I find myself standing on the edge of an island, one of many scattered across the Aegean like stones skipped by the hand of something vast and patient. The air here tastes of salt and thyme, of wild herbs growing between limestone cracks, where the earth meets the sky in a line so clear it seems drawn by intention. The wind moves differently here. It doesn't rush or hurry. It moves the way time moves when you're watching waves, each one arriving, retreating, arriving again. This is Crete, the largest of these islands, a place where mountains rise from the sea with a kind of ancient authority, their peaks still touched by snow, even as the valleys below bloom with wild flowers and the scent of cypress. The land here has been shaped by hands and seasons both, terraced hillsides that step down toward the coast, olive groves that have stood for generations, their trunks thick and twisted like the roots of time itself, and everywhere there is the presence of something that came before, something magnificent and strange and utterly its own. The ruins speak in fragments, in columns that once held up painted ceilings, in corridors that wind through structures so complex they inspired legends of labyrinths, in frescoes that still blaze with colors that should have faded millennia ago, reds like pomegranate seeds, blues deeper than the sea at noon, yellows bright as the sun that rises over these hills each morning without fail. These aren't the ruins of temples built to tower over mortals. These are the remains of palaces, of centers of life and commerce and culture, places where people lived and worked and celebrated, where they stored grain in massive jars tall as a person, where they conducted rituals we can only guess at, where they may have watched dancers leap over bulls in acts of courage or ceremony or something we have no words for anymore, the Minoans, though they never called themselves that. They lived here for thousands of years, their story woven into the very fabric of this landscape, into the clay they shaped into pottery so fine it seems to belong to a much later age, into the gold they worked into jewelry of astonishing delicacy, into the systems of plumbing and drainage that speak of sophistication we sometimes forget to expect from people we call ancient. They were sailors and traders, artists and architects, farmers who understood the rhythms of this demanding soil, people who built a civilization that reached across the sea, that left traces of itself on distant shores, that created something so distinctive that even now, even in fragments, it stops us and makes us wonder. The palace at Knossos rises from the earth like a memory made solid, its walls reconstructed in places, reimagined by archaeologists who tried to understand what once stood here, columns painted red and black, narrowing at the base in a way that defies what we think columns should do, rooms opening into more rooms, staircases leading up and down through multiple stories, light wells bringing sunshine down into the heart of the structure. It sprawls across the hillside, not in the rigid symmetry we associate with power, but in something more organic, more alive, as if it grew rather than was built. as if the people who made it understood that beauty doesn't always mean straight lines and perfect angles. Walking through these spaces, or what remains of them, there's a sense of encountering a world that had its own logic, its own aesthetics, its own understanding of what a civilization should look and feel like. The frescoes show us glimpses of that world. Women in elaborate dresses with fitted bodices and flounced skirts, their hair styled in elaborate curls and adorned with ribbons. Men with lean bodies and jeweled belts, participating in scenes of ritual and daily life, gardens full of flowers, processions bearing offerings, marine life rendered with such loving attention that you can almost hear the splash of water, smell the salt spray, and the writing, because they did write, not in the alphabet that would come later, but in something else, in symbols we call linear A, pressed into clay tablets that survived because fire baked them hard when the palaces burned. These tablets record transactions, lists of goods, religious offerings perhaps, but the language itself remains a mystery. The sounds of these ancient words locked away, just out of reach, a reminder that some things, despite all our tools and technology and desire to know, remain unknown, remain silent, holding their secrets close. The light is changing now, softening as it does in late afternoon when the sun begins its slow descent toward the western sea. Shadows grow longer across the stones, stretching across courtyards where once, perhaps, people gathered in the cool of evening. The air fills with the sound of birds settling into the pines, and somewhere in the distance, always, the sea continues its eternal conversation with the shore, speaking in rhythms these ancient people would have known, as well as their own heartbeats, would have marked their time by, would have trusted their lives to when they set sail in ships bound for Egypt, for the Levant, for other islands where they traded their goods and brought back things we find buried here now, ivory from far away, gold, precious stones, ideas. The story begins long before the palaces, long before the frescoes and the bulls, and the intricate gold jewelry that catches light even in museum cases. It begins in a time we can barely glimpse, a time of small settlements and stone tools, of people arriving on these islands by boat, carrying with them seeds and livestock and the knowledge of how to coax life from unfamiliar soil. These earliest inhabitants, whose names we will never know, who left behind only traces, pottery shards, and the foundations of simple dwellings. They were the first to understand what it meant to live here, on land surrounded by water, dependent on the sea and yet separate from it. Islanders in the truest sense. This was the Neolithic period, the New Stone Age, and on Crete it stretched across millennia, from perhaps 7,000 years before our common era until around 3,000, a span of time so vast that entire ways of life could rise and transform and settle into tradition. The people who lived through these centuries were farmers primarily, growing wheat and barley in the fertile valleys, tending sheep and goats on the hillsides where the grass grew thick in spring. They made pottery by hand, shaping clay into vessels that grew more sophisticated with each passing generation, learning through experimentation what clays worked best, what shapes held water without cracking, how fire could transform soft earth into something hard and useful and sometimes even beautiful. Their villages were small, clusters of rectangular houses built from stone and mud brick, with flat roofs that could be used as additional living space in the warm months. These weren't the elaborate structures that would come later, but they were solid, practical, built by people who understood their environment and worked with it rather than against it. They buried their dead in caves sometimes, or in collective tombs that suggest these early communities had developed ideas about kinship, about belonging to something larger than a single lifetime, about honoring those who came before, and then, gradually, subtly at first, things began to change. This change didn't happen in a single generation or even a single century. It unfolded across hundreds of years, so slowly that no one living through it would have called it a revolution. But looking back across the distance of millennia, we can see the shift, the emergence of something new. Around 3,000 years before our common era, the Bronze Age was beginning. Copper was being worked, and then copper mixed with tin to create bronze, harder and more durable, capable of holding an edge, capable of being cast into tools and weapons, and eventually into objects of pure artistry. The settlements grew larger, more complex. Storage buildings appeared, suggesting surplus, suggesting trade, suggesting that some people were beginning to specialize, to become potters or metalworkers or sailors, while others grew the food that fed them. This is how civilizations emerge, not all at once, not with a single dramatic moment, but through this quiet accumulation of changes, this gradual elaboration of social structures, this slow discovery that groups of people working together in specialized ways can accomplish things that scattered family units cannot. By 2,600 years before our common era, or perhaps a bit earlier, the first palaces were being built, not the grand structures whose ruins we see today, but earlier versions, smaller perhaps, less elaborate, but still representing something unprecedented on these islands. These weren't fortresses. They had no massive defensive walls. They weren't built on the highest hilltops where they could be most easily defended. Instead, they rose in valleys, near fertile land, near water sources, near the sea. They were centers, hubs, places where goods could be stored, where craftspeople could work, where administration could occur, where the increasingly complex web of Bronze Age life could be organized and maintained. The palace at Knossos was one of these early centers, perhaps the first, perhaps the most important, built on a low hill that overlooked the surrounding countryside, with access to the northern coast and its harbors. It began modestly, but even in its early form it showed the distinctive character that would define Minoan architecture. Rooms arranged not in rigid grid patterns, but in something more fluid, more organic, courtyards that brought light and air into the heart of the structure, storage magazines where enormous pithoi, storage jars, could hold oil and grain and wine, workshops where artisans created pottery and jewelry and textile goods that would be traded across the eastern Mediterranean. Other centers emerged as well. Phaistos in the south, looking out over the Mesara plain, one of the most fertile regions on the island, Malea on the north coast, Zakros in the far east. Each of these palaces had its own character, its own relationship to the landscape around it, but they shared certain features: central courtyards aligned on a north-south axis, complex room arrangements, sophisticated storage systems, evidence of bureaucratic record-keeping on clay tablets. They were nodes in a network, connected by roads that crossed the island, by ships that moved along the coasts and ventured out across the open water to other islands, to the mainland of Greece, to Cyprus and the Levant and Egypt. The people of this early palace period, which we date roughly from 2000 to 1700 years before our common era, were developing what would become the hallmarks of Minoan culture. Their pottery was evolving the simple geometric patterns of earlier eras, giving way to more naturalistic designs, spirals that seemed to move across the surface of the vessel, marine motifs, octopuses with curling tentacles that wrap around the belly of a jar, dolphins leaping, fish swimming in eternal procession. These weren't just decorations. They were expressions of a worldview, of a people who lived in intimate relationship with the sea, who drew their livelihood from it, who must have watched the waves and the creatures within them with a kind of daily attention that shaped their imagination. Their religious life was taking form as well, though we see it only in glimpses, in fragments that we piece together like a mosaic, with many tiles missing. There were shrines within the palaces, small rooms, with altars, with offering tables, with strange objects we call horns of consecration, stylized bull horns rendered in stone or plaster, marking sacred spaces. There were cave sanctuaries too, natural chambers deep in the mountains where people left offerings, bronze figurines, pottery, objects of devotion or petition, and there were peak sanctuaries, high places on mountain tops where rituals occurred, where perhaps people came to be closer to whatever powers they imagined dwelling above, or to see their island whole, spread out below them in a way that might have felt like seeing through the eyes of something greater than themselves. The evidence suggests a religion rich in female imagery, priestesses perhaps, or goddesses, figures depicted with snakes writhing in their upraised hands, with elaborate dress and exposed breasts, with expressions that seem both serene and powerful. Whether these represent a single great goddess or many different deities we cannot say with certainty. The linear A tablets that might tell us more keep their secrets, but the images themselves speak of a spiritual life that honored feminine power, that saw divinity in nature, in animals, in the fertility of fields, and the mystery of birth and growth and transformation. Trade was expanding during these centuries. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, in the Levant, in Anatolia, and foreign goods flowed back into Crete, gold from Nubia, ivory from Syria, tin from somewhere far away, perhaps Afghanistan, perhaps Britain. The networks required to move these materials across such distances speak to a level of organization, of trust, of shared language or understanding that must have developed through generations of contact. Minoan sailors were learning the patterns of wind and current, the locations of harbors and sources of fresh water, the political landscapes of distant shores. They were becoming cosmopolitan in a way, citizens not just of their island, but of a wider Mediterranean world. The settlements on Crete were growing too, spreading out from the palaces, towns and villages connected by roads paved with stone, houses built wall to wall, sharing common walls in a way that suggests both crowding and community. Some of these houses were quite elaborate, with multiple stories, with light wells and drainage systems, with walls painted in warm colors, reds and yellows and creams. The population was increasing, perhaps reaching as high as several 100,000 people across the island. a density that required careful management of resources, careful cultivation of every available piece of arable land, terracing of hillsides to create level planting surfaces, irrigation systems to move water where it was needed. And yet there is something puzzling about these Minoans, something that makes them different from other Bronze Age civilizations we know. There is no evidence of a standing army, no weapons caches in the palaces, no fortification walls, no imagery celebrating military conquest or showing rulers as warriors. This is striking, unusual, in an age when most societies were heavily militarized, when kings displayed their power through images of themselves trampling enemies, when cities protected themselves with massive defensive works. The Minoans seem to have invested their energy elsewhere, in art, in trade, in the elaboration of ceremonial life, in creating beauty rather than projecting force. Perhaps they were protected by the sea itself, by their location on an island that required ships to reach, by a navy that controlled the waters around them. Or perhaps there is something we're missing, some aspect of their society that doesn't preserve in the archaeological record, but the impression remains of a people who built palaces without walls, who depicted nature and ritual rather than battle, who seem to have flourished through connection and exchange rather than conquest. It's a tantalizing vision, one that has captured imaginations since these ruins were first excavated. The idea of a Bronze Age people who chose a different path. The centuries passed, and the palaces grew more elaborate, the art more sophisticated, the trade networks more extensive. Workshops within the palaces produced goods of extraordinary quality, stone vessels carved from multicolored stone, serpentine and limestone and volcanic rock, carved so thin they're almost translucent, with handles shaped like birds or flowers, faience objects, a glazed ceramic material, colored in brilliant blues and greens, shaped into plaques showing houses and landscapes, into beads and inlays for furniture. The craftspeople who made these things were specialists of the highest order, their skills passed down through apprenticeship, refined across generations. And then came the goldsmiths, working metal so fine it seems impossible even now, creating jewelry that speaks of steady hands and patient eyes, necklaces strung with beads shaped like flowers and leaves, each one formed individually, each one requiring hours of careful work, earrings that dangle with delicate chains, rings engraved with scenes of ceremony or daily life, seal stones carved with images so tiny they can only be appreciated with magnification, lions and griffins and bull-leaping scenes rendered in spaces smaller than a fingernail. These weren't just ornaments. They were marks of identity, of status, of connection to the complex social world that was flourishing across the island. The peak of Minoan Civilization, what archaeologists call the Neopalatial period, began around 1700 years before our common era, and it represents something remarkable, a cultural flowering that transformed not just Crete, but influenced the entire Aegean world. The palaces were rebuilt, expanded, elaborated into the complex structures whose ruins we see today. Knossos grew to cover an area of more than 20,000 square meters, a maze of rooms and corridors and staircases, some climbing to upper stories that no longer exist, some descending into storage areas and workshops below ground level. It had everything a Bronze Age center needed. Reception halls with columns painted in bright colors, residential quarters with bathrooms and toilets connected to sophisticated drainage systems, light wells that brought sunshine down through multiple floors, workshops where craftspeople created the goods that would be traded across the sea. The central courtyard at Knossos stretches out in a precise rectangle, oriented north to south, paved with stones worn smooth by centuries of feet. This was the heart of the palace, the space where ceremonies occurred, where perhaps bulls were led for the rituals we see depicted on frescoes and seal stones, where processions gathered before moving through the complex passages to shrines and sacred rooms. Standing in this space, even now, empty and silent, there's a sense of scale that surprises. It's large enough to hold crowds, to create drama, to serve as a stage for whatever spectacles or rituals the Minoans conducted. Yet it's also somehow intimate, enclosed by the buildings that rise on all sides, creating a world within a world. The frescoes that decorated these palace walls are among the most striking artifacts that survive, painted in true fresco technique. Pigments applied to wet plaster so they become part of the wall itself. They show us a world of color and movement, of people engaged in activities that mattered to them. In the grand procession fresco from Knossos, figures move in profile, carrying vessels and offerings, their skin painted in the convention of the time. Men in red-brown, women in white, their clothing rendered in intricate detail, the men in loincloths and decorated kilts, the women in those remarkable dresses with fitted bodices and tiered flounced skirts, their hair elaborately curled and adorned. The bull-leaping fresco captures something that seems almost impossible, a moment of dangerous grace. An athlete, painted white and therefore likely female, is shown mid-vault, suspended above the back of a charging bull, grasping its horns, her body arched in a perfect curve. Another figure waits behind the bull, arms outstretched, ready to catch or steady the leper. The bull itself is rendered with careful attention, its muscles defined, its motion captured in mid-charge. This wasn't a bullfight in the way later cultures would understand it. There's no killing, no weapons. Instead, it shows something that might have been sport or ritual, or both. An act requiring extraordinary courage and timing, a dance with death that perhaps honored the power of the bull, that animal so central to Minoan imagery. The marine frescoes transport us to an underwater world, or perhaps to the view from a boat looking down into clear Aegean waters. The famous dolphin fresco from the Queen's Megaron at Knossos shows 3 dolphins swimming through a sea rendered in bands of color, deep blue fading to lighter shades. Fish swim around them. The composition is naturalistic in its observation of how these creatures move, yet also stylized, decorative. The dolphins curve gracefully, their bodies positioned to create a pleasing pattern across the wall. Whoever painted this knew dolphins, had watched them closely, had seen how they arc through water, how they seem to play in the waves near boats. There are garden frescoes, too, showing plants rendered with botanical accuracy, lilies and crocuses and irises, rocks that seem to grow organically from the ground, birds perched among the flowers, monkeys too, imported perhaps as exotic pets, as symbols of far-reaching trade connections. These images create environments. They transform interior walls into imagined landscapes. They bring the outside world in. They make rooms feel less enclosed, more connected to the natural world that surrounded the palaces. to the gardens that likely grew in courtyards and terraces, watered carefully through the long dry summers, tended by hands that understood how to coax beauty from the Mediterranean climate. The writing system was developing during this period, evolving from the earlier hieroglyphic script and linear A into what would become linear B, though that transition lay in the future passé. For now, linear A was used to record the administrative details of palace life. Clay tablets were inscribed with symbols representing syllables, creating words we cannot yet read. But the structure is clear. Lists of goods, inventories, religious offerings perhaps, the bureaucratic machinery that kept these complex centers running, that tracked who owed what, who had paid tribute, what stores were held in which magazines. It's easy to overlook these tablets, to focus instead on the beautiful art, but these mundane records are in their own way equally revealing. They show us a society that had developed systems, hierarchies, specialized roles, the infrastructure of civilization. Daily life in neo-palatial Crete would have varied enormously depending on one's position in society. A craftsperson working in a palace workshop had a very different existence from a farmer, tending terraced fields in the hills, from a sailor navigating trade routes to Cyprus, from a priestess conducting rituals in a peak sanctuary, but certain rhythms would have been shared. The cycle of seasons that determined when crops were planted and harvested, when sheep were sheared, when ships could safely sail, the religious festivals that marked the year, times when processions wound through palace corridors and out into the countryside, when offerings were made, when communities gathered. The houses in the towns surrounding the palaces show us something of how people lived. Some were quite large, multi-story structures with rooms arranged around courtyards, with stairs leading to upper floors, with storage areas and workshops on the ground level, and living spaces above. Walls were often decorated, not with the elaborate frescoes of the palaces, but with simpler painted designs, geometric patterns or bands of color. Floors might be paved with stone or plastered and painted. Furniture doesn't survive, but we can infer from frescoes and other evidence that people sat on chairs and benches, slept on raised platforms or beds, stored their belongings in chests and baskets. Food would have been prepared over hearths, though interestingly these aren't always found in Minoan houses. Perhaps cooking was done in shared spaces or outdoors in warm weather. The diet was Mediterranean, grains processed into bread and porridge, legumes like lentils and chickpeas, vegetables from gardens, figs and grapes and olives, cheese from sheep and goats, meat on special occasions, fish from the sea, wine that was produced from grapes grown in terraced vineyards, stored in those enormous pithoi, oil pressed from olives, used for cooking and lighting, and probably for anointing the body, honey from bees that fed on the island's wild herbs, giving it distinctive flavors that varied by region. The textile industry was significant, though fabric rarely survives in the archaeological record. We know from linear A tablets and from depictions in art that cloth was produced in large quantities. Sheep were raised for their wool. Flax was grown and processed into linen. The elaborate dresses shown in frescoes had to be woven, requiring large looms and skilled hands, dyed using pigments derived from plants and minerals and perhaps from the murex snail that produced the prized purple dye of the ancient world, embroidered or decorated with applied designs The patterns on clothing were as important as the garments themselves. They marked identity, indicated status, pleased the eye, showed that the wearer belonged to a society that valued beauty and had the resources to pursue it. Religion permeated this world. Though we see it through a glass darkly, shrines existed within the palaces, small rooms with platforms for offerings, with ritual vessels shaped like rhytons, horn-shaped drinking vessels, often with animal heads at the base, bulls or lions or griffins. These were used in ceremonies, perhaps filled with wine or blood. Part of rituals we can only imagine. There were double axes, the labris, which appear again and again in Minoan imagery, sometimes held by figures, sometimes standing alone as symbols, associated with sacred spaces, with divinity. The word labris may be connected to labyrinth, that word which comes down to us from Greek myth, from the story of the maze built to contain the Minotaur, that hybrid creature, half man, half bull. And here the myths brush against the archaeological reality, because there's no evidence of a literal labyrinth at Knossos, no maze designed to trap people. But the palace itself is labyrinthine in its complexity, its interconnected rooms and corridors, its multiple levels, its disorienting layout that can confuse even modern visitors. Perhaps the memory of these elaborate buildings passed down through generations, through the dark age that would come later. Perhaps that memory transformed into myth, became the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, of Ariadne and her thread, of Daedalus, the craftsman who built wings from feathers and wax. The bull is everywhere in Minoan art, in frescoes and sculptures, on seal stones and pottery, depicted with power and grace, never as something merely domestic, always as something more symbol of strength, of fertility, of divine power perhaps. The horns of consecration that mark sacred spaces echo the bull's horns, create a visual language that would have been immediately understood by people moving through these spaces, that would have signaled, here is something holy. Here is a place where the ordinary world touches something else. Peak sanctuaries dotted the mountaintops of Crete, simple structures, not elaborate temples, places where people climbed carrying offerings, bronze figurines of humans and animals, pottery vessels, leaving these gifts in gratitude or petition, standing on the heights where wind moves differently, where clouds sometimes descend to meet the earth, where the entire island spreads out below, a patchwork of cultivated valleys and wild mountains, of olive groves and vineyards, of towns clustered around palaces and villages scattered across the landscape, of coastline jagged and beautiful, of sea extending to the horizon. These peak sanctuaries suggest a religious impulse that sought high places, that wanted to stand between earth and sky, that recognized something sacred in elevation, in the effort required to climb, in the view that rewards those who make the ascent. The Minoans were master sailors. This much is clear from the extent of their trade networks, from the presence of Minoan goods across the eastern Mediterranean, from the stories that echo in later Greek literature about Cretan naval power. Their ships were built from timbers cut in the island's forests, cypress and pine, constructed with techniques learned over generations, with sails woven from linen, with oars, for when the wind failed, they navigated by the stars, by the patterns of currents and winds, by the flights of birds and the colors of water, by accumulated knowledge passed from experienced sailors to novices. They knew where harbors could be found, where fresh water was available, where hostile peoples dwelt and where friendly traders waited. They carried cargoes that tell us what the Minoans valued and what others valued from them. Pottery, of course, those distinctive vessels with marine designs, with spirals and floral patterns, with shapes that evolved across the centuries. Oil and wine in amphorae sealed with clay stoppers. Textiles woven from fine wool or linen, dyed in colors that commanded high prices. Saffron, perhaps, harvested from the crocuses that bloomed across the island, used as spice and dye and medicine. Purple cloth that required thousands of murex snails to produce even a small amount of dye. They brought back raw materials that Crete lacked: copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, gold and ivory, obsidian from the volcanic islands, ideas, too, artistic motifs that influenced their own work, techniques in metalworking and stone carving, stories and songs that don't survive but must have traveled as surely as the physical goods. But nothing lasts forever, and even at the height of Minoan power, even during this neopalatial flowering, there were forces at work that would bring profound change. Around 1600 years before our common era, something catastrophic occurred. The volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, which lay about 100 kilometers north of Crete, erupted with extraordinary violence, one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was heard across the Mediterranean, the sky filled with ash that darkened the sun, that fell across the sea like gray snow, that buried the Minoan settlement on Thera under meters of pumice and ash, preserving it in a moment, like Pompeii centuries later, creating a time capsule that would wait millennia to be discovered. The effects on Crete must have been severe. Ash falling from the sky, covering crops and fouling water sources, tsunamis generated by the eruption and the collapse of the volcanic cone, waves that would have struck the northern coast of Crete with devastating force, washing away coastal settlements, destroying ships in harbors, penetrating inland along river valleys. The archaeological evidence shows destruction at many sites, burning, collapse, abandonment, though scholars debate how much of this was directly caused by the eruption and how much by other factors, by earthquakes, perhaps, by human conflict, by a combination of natural and social disasters that converged in a relatively short period. The palaces were damaged, some severely, but they were rebuilt. This is important to understand. The Minoans didn't simply vanish after Thera erupted. They persisted. They cleared away the rubble and constructed new buildings. They continued creating art and conducting trade. But something had shifted. The nature of that shift is debated. Some see evidence of mainland Greek influence increasing after this point, of Mycenaean culture from the mainland beginning to penetrate Cretan society. The Linear B script appears, a modified version of Linear A that we can read because it's an early form of Greek. The tablets from this later period are in Greek, not in whatever language the Minoans spoke. This suggests new rulers, perhaps, or at least new administrators, people from the mainland who had taken control of the palace centers. The final palace period, from around 1500 to 1370 years before our common era, shows continuity with earlier traditions, but also changes. The architecture remains distinctively Minoan in many ways, but there are new elements. Warrior imagery appears more frequently. Depictions of boar's tusk helmets and figure-8 shields. The kinds of military equipment we see in Mycenaean contexts. Tombs begin to show mainland influences. Chamber tombs cut into hillsides, with long entrance passages called dromoi, containing grave goods that blend Minoan and Mycenaean styles. It's a picture of cultural fusion, of two traditions meeting and mingling, though the exact political relationship remains unclear. Were the Mycenaeans conquerors, trading partners, migrants, all of these at different times and places perhaps? Life continued. People still farmed the terraced hillsides, still pressed olives and made wine, still tended their sheep and goats, still fished the waters around the island. The craft traditions persisted. Potters still produced beautiful vessels. Though the styles were evolving, metalworkers still created jewelry and tools and weapons. The palaces still functioned as administrative centers, still stored surplus grain and oil, still organized religious festivals and ceremonies. But the world was changing. The Eastern Mediterranean was entering a period of upheaval, of movement and conflict, of systems that had seemed stable beginning to fracture. Around 1450 years before our common era, Knossos was destroyed. Fire swept through the palace, collapsing the upper floors, shattering the painted pottery stored in magazines, baking the linear B tablets that recorded the palace's last days, inventories of chariots and weapons, lists of personnel, records that hint at mobilization, at preparation for conflict or defense. The destruction was thorough, and this time there was no major rebuilding. The great palace that had stood for centuries, that had been the center of Minoan civilization, fell silent, its rooms gradually filling with debris, its frescoes exposed to weather, its columns collapsing, becoming the ruins that later Greeks would see and wonder at, that would inspire their own myths and legends. Other sites show similar patterns of destruction and abandonment during this period, not all at once, but spread across decades. Some settlements were burned, others simply deserted. People moved away, or died, or were killed. The population declined. The elaborate trade networks contracted. The production of fine goods decreased. This was part of a wider Bronze Age collapse that affected civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean palaces on the Greek mainland were destroyed. Cities in the Levant burned. Egypt was invaded by mysterious groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. The interconnected world of the late Bronze Age was coming apart. The systems that had enabled trade and cultural exchange and relative stability were breaking down. The causes were complex. No single explanation suffices. There were environmental factors, perhaps. Drought and crop failure, earthquakes that struck repeatedly across the region. There were political upheavals, migrations of peoples displaced by changes elsewhere, warfare between kingdoms competing for diminishing resources. There were economic problems. The palatial systems that had organized production and distribution may have become too rigid, too top-heavy, unable to adapt when conditions changed. The complexity that had been a strength became a vulnerability when the networks that sustained it were disrupted. On Crete, life continued after the palaces fell, but it was different, simpler, more localized. People lived in smaller settlements, villages rather than towns. They farmed and herded and fished as they always had, but without the elaborate administrative structures, without the specialized craftspeople producing luxury goods, without the far-reaching trade that had brought exotic materials and foreign influences. Pottery became simpler, less decorated, functional rather than artistic. Writing seems to have been abandoned. The linear B tablets stop, and with them we lose the written record, moving back into a kind of darkness, not the darkness of absence, but of silence, of voices that no longer speak to us directly. This period, which archaeologists call the post-palatial or sub-Minoan, extended from around 1300 to 1000 years before our common era. It's poorly understood, not because people weren't living on Crete, they clearly were, but because they left fewer traces. Their material culture was less distinctive, less elaborate. They weren't building stone palaces or painting frescoes or creating intricate jewelry. They were surviving, maintaining communities, passing on traditions in altered forms, gradually transforming into what would eventually become the Greek culture of the historical period. New peoples were arriving too, migrants from the mainland, bringing their own customs and beliefs, their own pottery styles and burial practices, their own language, Greek, which was replacing whatever the Minoans had spoken, a language that vanished, leaving only scattered traces, words that survived in Greek that seemed to be non-Greek in origin, place names on Crete that don't parse in Greek, linguistic ghosts that hint at what was lost. The process of cultural change wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded across generations. Children growing up speaking different languages than their grandparents, adopting new styles while retaining fragments of old ones, creating something hybrid, something that carried forward certain Minoan elements even as it became something else entirely. By the time Greece entered the historical period, by the time the Greeks were writing in their alphabet and recording their history and philosophy, the memory of Bronze Age Crete had become legend. They remembered that Crete had been important, powerful, that a king named Minos had ruled there. Whether Minos was a real person or a title, or purely mythical, is unclear, but the name persisted, gave us the word Minoan, coined by archaeologist Arthur Evans when he excavated Knossos in the early 20th century. The Greeks told stories about Crete, about Daedalus the master craftsman, about the labyrinth and the Minotaur, about Theseus who came from Athens and slew the beast and escaped with Ariadne's help, about Icarus who flew too close to the sun. These myths preserve echoes of historical reality. The importance of Crete in the Bronze Age, the elaborate architecture of the palaces, the bull cults that played such a central role in Minoan religion, the maritime power that made Crete a force in the Aegean, but their memories transformed by time and oral transmission, shaped by the concerns and values of later Greeks. Not direct historical accounts, but something else. Stories that meant something to the people who told them, that explained their world and its past, that connected them to the ruins they could still see. Those massive walls and collapsed columns that spoke of a vanished greatness. Standing among those ruins now, in the long light of late afternoon, with shadows stretching across ancient stones, it's possible to feel the weight of all those centuries, all those lives lived and lost, the children who played in these courtyards, the craftspeople who shaped clay and stone and metal with patient skill, the sailors who departed on voyages and returned with tales of distant shores, the priestesses who conducted rituals whose meanings we can only guess at, the farmers who knew every field and tree on their land, who watched the seasons turn year after year, who understood rhythms we've forgotten, all of them gone, leaving only these fragments, these beautiful fragments that catch the light and make us wonder. The story of the Minoans is in one sense a story of loss, of a civilization that flourished and then faded, that left us treasures but no voice, beauty but no words we can understand. But it's also a story of persistence, of how ideas and aesthetics and ways of understanding the world can influence cultures far removed in time, how the Minoans shaped Greek culture, which shaped Roman culture, which shaped our own, how their art still has the power to move us, how their palaces still inspire wonder, how their story still calls to us across the millennia, inviting us to imagine, to connect, to remember. The question that lingers in the quietness of these ruins is not simply what happened, but what it all meant, what these people understood about themselves and their place in the world. We look at their art and see certain things, beauty, sophistication, a love of nature, but what did they see when a Minoan woman looked at a fresco of dolphins? Did she think of them as we do, as graceful marine mammals, or did they carry meanings we can't access, associations with divinity or seasonal cycles or stories passed down through generations? The gap between seeing and understanding is vast and humbling. There's something about the Minoan aesthetic that feels almost modern. The fluid lines, the naturalistic rendering of plants and animals, the sense of movement captured in paint, the lack of rigid hierarchical symbolism, no pharaohs 3 times larger than their subjects, no kings trampling enemies. Instead, we see people in gardens, in rituals, in moments of grace and danger. We see the world observed closely, rendered with affection. This speaks to values, to what a culture chooses to depict and how it chooses to depict it. And the Minoan choice was toward life, toward nature, toward the beautiful and the graceful rather than the martial and the dominating. The role of women in Minoan society remains a subject of fascination and debate. The prominence of female figures in art, the priestesses or goddesses with their elaborate dress and commanding presence, the snake goddesses with their exposed breasts and upraised arms. These suggest that women held positions of religious authority, perhaps of political power as well. This would have been unusual in the ancient world, where most societies were strongly patriarchal, where women's roles were circumscribed and domestic. But the evidence from Crete hints at something different, not necessarily a matriarchy, but perhaps a more balanced distribution of power and prestige, a recognition of female authority in certain spheres. The linear A tablets, still undeciphered despite decades of effort, tantalize us with their silence. They're not numerous enough to provide the kind of statistical analysis that has helped decipher other ancient scripts, and the language they encode seems to be unrelated to any known language family. It's possible we'll never read them, that the Minoan language will remain forever locked away. This is frustrating from a scholarly perspective, but there's also something fitting about it, something that preserves mystery, that reminds us that not everything can be known, that some voices from the past speak in frequencies we can't quite hear, no matter how carefully we listen. The relationship between the Minoans and the natural world that surrounded them seems to have been intimate, almost sacramental. They lived on an island where the sea was never far away, where mountains rose dramatically, where earthquakes reminded people of the earth's power, where volcanic eruptions could darken the sky. This wasn't a tamed landscape. It was beautiful and bountiful, but also dangerous, unpredictable. The Minoans seem to have responded not by trying to dominate it, but by acknowledging its power, incorporating it into their religious and artistic vision. The bulls and the snakes and the double axes weren't just symbols. They were attempts to engage with forces larger than human, to find ways of living in relationship with a world that could nurture or destroy. Time moves differently when we think in terms of civilizations rather than individual lives. The Minoan culture lasted for well over 1,000 years, longer than the distance between our own time and the early Middle Ages, longer than from the Norman conquest to now. That's an almost incomprehensible span. Generations upon generations living under the same general cultural framework, speaking the same language, worshiping in similar ways, yet surely changing too, evolving, adapting. No culture is static, even one we see only in archaeological snapshots. There would have been conservatives who wanted to maintain tradition and innovators who pushed for change. Debates we can't hear about proper ritual or artistic style or how to respond to foreign influences. The end of the palaces wasn't the end of the Minoans as a people. This is important to understand. Cultures don't simply vanish. They transform. They blend with new arrivals. They persist in modified forms. The people living on Crete after 1,300 years before our common era were descendants of the palace builders. They carried forward genetic heritage and certainly some cultural practices, stories, perhaps fragments of the old language embedded in the Greek they increasingly spoke. The elaborate palatial system had collapsed, but ordinary life continued. Fields were still planted, olives still harvested, children still born and named and raised, the rhythms of a daily existence persisting even as the grand structures crumbled. What would it have been like to live in that transitional time? To be part of the last generations that remembered the palaces in their glory, to hear stories from grandparents about great festivals and processions, about ships arriving with exotic goods, about craftspeople creating beautiful things, and then to see those memories fade, to watch the old ways disappear, to realize that something important had been lost. There must have been grief, a sense of diminishment, the world becoming smaller and poorer, and yet also the stubborn persistence of ordinary life, the daily tasks that connect us to the earth and the seasons regardless of what kingdoms rise or fall. The palace at Knossos stands partially reconstructed now. Arthur Evans' controversial restoration from the early 20th century, concrete and painted columns that show what he imagined the palace looked like. Scholars debate whether he got it right, whether the reconstructions help or hinder our understanding. But walking through those spaces, seeing the columns against the sky, the stairways leading up through the multiple floors, the light wells and courtyards, there's an experiential quality that photographs of bare ruins can't capture, a sense of scale and movement through space, of how it might have felt to navigate these corridors, to emerge into the sudden openness of the central court, to climb stairs knowing there are rooms above and rooms below, a vertical complexity that speaks to architectural ambition. The frescoes we see in museums, carefully preserved behind glass, rendered flat by their display, were meant to be encountered differently, in dim interior spaces lit by oil lamps, their colors glowing in flickering light, as you moved through rooms and down corridors, catching glimpses, full views, fragments, part of a total environment that included the smell of oil and incense, the sound of footsteps on stone, the voices of people conducting their daily business or celebrating their festivals. Art wasn't separate from life. It was the setting for life, the backdrop against which human drama unfolded. And now these remains speak to us across the gulf of 3.5 millennia. They ask us to imagine, to stretch our understanding, to recognize both connection and difference. These were people like us in their essential humanity. They felt love and fear and joy and grief. They wondered about the world. They created beauty because beauty mattered to them. They organized themselves into communities and struggled with the eternal problems of how to live together, how to distribute resources, how to honor the sacred, how to remember the dead, and yet they were also profoundly different, shaped by their particular time and place, by beliefs and assumptions we can only dimly perceive, by a relationship to the divine and to nature that may have been unlike our own. The light is fading now, the sun dropping toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the same colors that appear in Minoan frescoes, the same light that has been setting over this island since long before humans arrived, that watched the first Neolithic farmers clear land and plant crops, that shone on the building of the first palaces, that illuminated the faces of priestesses conducting rituals, and sailors departing on voyages, and craftspeople bent over their work, that witnessed the eruption of Thera and the smoke rising into the sky, that saw the palaces burn and fall silent and slowly collapse, that continues now, indifferent to human affairs, beautiful and eternal in a way that no civilization can be. The sea continues its endless conversation with the shore, waves arriving in rhythms that have not changed, that will not change. The mountains stand as they have always stood, patient and weathered, home to herbs that still bloom in spring, to ruins that still catch the light. The wind moves through empty doorways, through collapsed halls, where once there were painted ceilings and the sound of voices, through magazines where enormous pithoi stand like silent witnesses, still holding their positions after all these centuries, empty now, their contents long since consumed or spilled, but present, enduring, marking the spaces where people once stored their surplus against an uncertain future. The story of the Minoans is finished, has been finished for more than 3,000 years, and yet it continues in the objects preserved in museums, in the ruins that dot the Cretan landscape, in the myths that echo their memory, in the influence they had on Greek culture, and through it on all of Western civilization, in the imaginations of everyone who encounters their art and wonders who created it, what they believed, how they lived. The story continues because we continue to tell it, to piece it together from fragments, to fill the silences with our questions and our careful scholarly reconstructions and our flights of imagination. Night is coming, slowly, gently, the way it always comes to this island, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars the Minoans navigated by, constellations they may have named differently, but recognized just as we do, marking the seasons and the directions, connecting Earth to the vast universe beyond. In the darkness, the ruins lose their distinctness, become shapes, shadows, presences. Time seems to fold, the distance between then and now growing less certain, as if in this particular light, this particular moment, the past and present exist together, as if the voices might speak again, the footsteps sound on stone, the lamps be lit in rooms now open to the sky, But there is only silence, the deep silence of a world that has passed beyond speech, beyond recovery, a silence that is not empty but full of all the lives that were lived here, all the moments of joy and sorrow and ordinary dailiness, all the dreams and struggles and achievements, a silence that holds everything that has been lost and everything that remains, preserved in stone and clay and paint, in the earth itself, waiting, patient, holding its stories close, offering us glimpses, inviting us to wonder, to imagine, to remember. And so the story ends where it began, with the sea, with the mountains, with the light changing across ancient stones, with the sense of something precious and vanished, something that speaks to us still across the millennia, something that reminds us that all civilizations rise and flourish and fade, that beauty persists even when its makers are forgotten, that the human impulse to create, to build, to make meaning, continues generation after generation, undefeated by time, undiminished by loss, enduring. The wind stirs, carrying the scent of wild thyme, of sea salt, of earth warmed by the sun and now slowly cooling. The first stars shine steady and bright, eternal witnesses, and the island rests as it has always rested, holding its secrets, offering its beauty, remembering. There is a certain kind of silence that exists in a room where something is thinking, not a living creature, but a machine, humming softly in the corner of a laboratory, a presence made of circuits and light. And in that silence, there is a story that stretches back through decades, through centuries of human dreaming. A story of how we learned to build beautiful minds from metal and glass, how we taught sand to remember, and how the world changed quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time. I find myself drawn tonight to this story, to the gentle unfolding of an idea that began long before the first computer ever switched on, back when computation meant something entirely different, when it meant a person sitting at a desk, working through columns of numbers with a pencil, their hand moving steadily across the page, carrying remainders, checking sums, the scratch of graphite on paper, the only sound in rooms where the future was being calculated by hand. The story doesn't begin with a sudden flash of invention, but rather with a slow accumulation, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river, layer upon layer of human ingenuity, each generation adding something to what came before, building toward a threshold they couldn't quite see yet, though some of them sensed it, dreamed of it, wrote about it in letters and journals that survive to this day. Picture the world in the 1800s, when mathematicians like Charles Babbage sat in their studies, contemplating engines made of brass and iron, machines with thousands of moving parts, gears that would mesh and turn, carrying mechanical memory from one operation to the next, his analytical engine never fully built in his lifetime, but alive in detailed drawings, in the careful notations of Ada Lovelace, who saw in those theoretical gears something more than mere calculation, who glimpsed the possibility that such a machine might one day manipulate symbols, create patterns, perhaps even compose music, the quiet patience required to imagine such things, to design mechanisms that wouldn't be built for another century. There's something deeply peaceful about that kind of forward thinking, that faith in future minds who would pick up the thread and continue the work. And they did continue it, through the mechanical calculators of the late 19th century, through the punched card systems that Hermann Hollerith developed, cards with patterns of Herbriso holes that could be sorted and counted by machine, used first to process the American census, transforming months of labor into weeks, the cards passing through readers, pins dropping through holes to complete circuits, a kind of binary thinking already emerging. Yes or no, hole or no hole, on or off. There's something almost meditative about imagining those cards stacked in boxes, each one encoding a piece of information, each hole punched with precision, the mechanical sorters clicking and whirring as they organized data, finding patterns in populations, in demographics, in the countless small facts that make up a society, and then, gradually, as the 20th century began to unfold, the technology started to shift, started to incorporate electrical components, relays that could open and close faster than any mechanical gear, vacuum tubes that could switch currents on and off in fractions of a second. And with these new components, the possibilities began to expand, to accelerate, though still at what would seem to us now like a glacial pace. The story gathers momentum in the years before and during the Second World War, when urgent questions demanded urgent answers, when the need to break codes, to calculate trajectories, to process vast amounts of information quickly, pushed inventors and mathematicians and engineers to think differently, to work with new urgency. And yet even in that urgency there was careful thought, deliberate design, the kind of focused attention that creates lasting change. Tonight, as I trace this story out, I can almost hear the echo of those early machine rooms, the clatter of relays switching, the warm glow of vacuum tubes lighting up panels in dim laboratories, the smell of hot electronics and machine oil, and the people who tended these machines, who programmed them with patch cables and switches, who learned to think in the binary language that the machines understood, creating a new kind of conversation between human and mechanism, between question and answer. In the 1930s and early 40s, the idea of a universal computing machine was still more philosophy than reality, still living in the realm of thought experiments and theoretical papers. Alan Turing, working at Cambridge and later at Bletchley Park, had described in 1936 what he called a universal machine, an abstract concept, a device that could read symbols on an infinite tape, process them according to a set of rules, and write new symbols back. It was mathematics, pure and theoretical, but it contained within it the seed of every computer that would ever exist. The beauty of Turing's concept was its simplicity, its reduction of all computation to basic operations. Read a symbol, change state, write a symbol, move the tape, and yet from these simple steps not infinite complexity could emerge. Any calculation that could be described algorithmically could be performed given enough time, enough tape, enough patience, but patience was something the world of the 1940s couldn't afford much of. War had come to Europe, and with it, an urgent need for machines that could break encrypted messages, that could calculate artillery tables, that could process information faster than rooms full of human computers ever could. And so the theoretical began to become practical. The abstract began to take physical form. At Bletchley Park, in the British countryside, away from the bombs falling on London, a team of mathematicians and engineers built machines to break the German Enigma code, The bomb machines, electromechanical devices that could test thousands of possible rotor settings, clicking through combinations, searching for the one arrangement that would unlock that day's messages. Turing himself worked there, applying his theoretical knowledge to very practical problems. The machines running day and night, their operators listening to the rhythm of the rotors, learning to hear when the machine had found something promising. And then came Colossus, completed in 1943 at Bletchley Park, designed by Tommy Flowers and his team, the first programmable electronic digital computer using vacuum tubes instead of mechanical relays, processing the encrypted German high command messages, the Lorenz cipher, far more complex than Enigma. Colossus used over 2,000 vacuum tubes, reading paper tape at high speed, 5,000 characters per second, a speed that seemed almost magical at the time. The room where Colossus operated was kept secret for decades after the war. The machine itself was largely destroyed, its existence classified, but it represented a threshold crossed. The proof that electronic components could be arranged to perform logical operations, that light could flow through circuits faster than thought, that electricity itself could be made to think in its own binary way. Across the Atlantic, parallel developments were unfolding at the University of Pennsylvania in a former fraternity house. Work began in 1943 on a machine called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, commissioned by the United States Army to calculate artillery firing tables, the trajectories of shells, the countless variables of wind and weather and angle that determined where a projectile would land. ENIAC was enormous, occupying a room 40 feet by 80 feet. Weighing 30 tons, containing 17,000 vacuum tubes, 7,000 crystal diodes, 10,000 capacitors, 70,000 resistors, 5 million hand-soldered joints. It consumed 150 kilowatts of power, enough to dim the lights in the neighborhood when it was switched on. The heat from all those vacuum tubes made the room unbearably warm, fans running constantly to prevent the components from burning out. Programming ENIAC was an elaborate physical process. Engineers, many of them women who had worked as human computers during the war, would set switches and plug in cables, physically routing the flow of electricity through different pathways to create different calculations. It could take days to set up a new problem, but once configured, ENIAC could perform calculations in seconds that would have taken human computers days or weeks to complete. The women who programmed ENIAC, Betty Snyder, John Bartik, Kay McNulty, Marlon Westkoff, Ruth Lichterman, Francis Belis, learned the machine's architecture intimately, understood how pulses of electricity moved through the circuits, how to diagnose problems when tubes failed, which happened frequently. They became the first true programmers. Though their contributions would be overlooked for decades, their work classified, their names absent from early histories. ENIAC was completed in 1945, just as the war was ending. Its first problems were peaceful, calculating tables for engineers, but also running calculations for the hydrogen bomb project, processing numbers that describe the physics of fusion, the enormous energies involved, the conditions that might allow humanity to recreate the power of stars. There's something profound in the fact that these early computers, built during wartime with military funding for military purposes, contained within them the seeds of transformation that would touch every aspect of human life, that the same machines designed to calculate destruction would eventually evolve into tools for creation, for communication, for preserving memory and knowledge. The late 1940s saw rapid evolution. John von Neumann, a mathematician of extraordinary range, working at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, proposed a new architecture, a way of organizing computers that would become foundational, the von Neumann architecture, where both instructions and data were stored in the same memory, where programs could be modified by the computer itself, where software became as important as hardware. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. It meant that computers could be general-purpose machines, not hardwired for a single calculation, but flexible, capable of running different programs, of being transformed by the instructions fed into them. The hardware remained the same, but the behavior could be completely different depending on what was stored in memory. The EDVAC, Electronic Discrete Variable Automatic Computer, was designed with this architecture in mind, though it wasn't completed until 1952. By then, other machines had already implemented von Neumann's ideas. The Manchester Baby, built at the University of Manchester in England, ran its first program in June of 1948, a small machine by the standards of ENIAC, containing only 544 vacuum tubes, but it was the first stored program computer to actually run, to execute instructions that were held in electronic memory rather than set by cables and switches. The program it ran was simple, designed to find the highest factor of a number. It ran for 52 minutes, cycling through calculations, and when it completed, it had proven something fundamental, that von Neumann's architecture worked, that computers could be programmed in software rather than hardware, that a new era had begun. At Cambridge, Morris Wilks and his team built EDSAC, the Electronic Delay Storage Automatic Calculator, which began operating in May of 1949. It used mercury delay lines for memory, tubes filled with mercury where sound waves would travel, carrying pulses of information, the pulses bouncing back and forth, circulating through the tubes, each tube storing a few dozen numbers. The technology seems almost archaic now, using sound waves in liquid metal as a form of memory, but it worked. It was practical, and EDSAC ran for years, calculating problems in physics and engineering, becoming the first computer to provide a regular computing service to users. Wilks also developed one of the first assembly languages, a way of writing programs using symbolic instructions rather than pure binary, making it easier for humans to express algorithms, to think in terms that were closer to mathematics than to raw machine operations. And with that, programming began to become a craft, a discipline, something that required not just mathematical knowledge, but also a kind of creative problem-solving, a way of breaking down complex tasks into sequences of simple operations that a machine could execute. In America, UNIVAC-1, the Universal Automatic Computer, was completed in 1951, the first computer produced commercially in the United States. Remington Rand manufactured it, selling the first unit to the Census Bureau, bringing the story full circle back to Hollerith's punched cards. But now the processing was electronic, vastly faster, capable of handling the complexity of a modern census with something approaching ease. UNIVAC became famous in 1952 when it predicted the outcome of the presidential election, Eisenhower versus Stevenson, The CBS network had arranged to use UNIVAC to forecast results based on early returns. The machine predicted a landslide for Eisenhower, but the human experts didn't believe it, thought the computer must be wrong. So CBS waited to announce the prediction, and then, as the votes came in, the prediction proved accurate. The machine had seen patterns that the human analysts had missed, and suddenly the public began to understand that computers might be more than just calculating machines, that they might process information in ways that exceeded human capability. The 1950s brought a peculiar atmosphere to the world of computing. These machines still occupied entire rooms, still required teams of specialists to operate, still consumed enormous amounts of power, and yet they were becoming less rare, moving from military laboratories into universities, into government agencies, into the research departments of large corporations. IBM, which had been manufacturing punched card equipment for decades, began to take computing seriously, investing in research, in development, in the production of machines that could be leased to businesses. The IBM 701, announced in 1952, was designed for business applications, not scientific calculations. It could read and write magnetic tape, process records, sort data, generate reports, the kind of work that businesses needed, accounting, inventory, payroll, and with each installation, computing moved a little further from the exclusive domain of mathematicians and physicists, began to touch the ordinary operations of commerce and administration. There was still an almost mystical quality to these machines, the way they filled rooms with their presence, rows of cabinets lined with electronics, panels of blinking lights, the whir of magnetic tape drives spinning, starting and stopping, the chatter of line printers hammering characters onto paper, operators moving between the machines, loading tapes, checking printouts, monitoring the status lights for signs of trouble. Vacuum tubes still failed regularly. Each machine had spare tubes on hand, and technicians who knew how to diagnose problems, how to locate the failed component among thousands, replace it, bring the machine back to life. Programming these machines required a deep understanding of their architecture, how memory was organized, how arithmetic operations were performed, how input and output worked. Early programmers worked with machine code, pure sequences of binary numbers, each instruction specifying an operation and the memory addresses it would work with. It was painstaking, error-prone. A single wrong digit could crash the entire program, and debugging meant poring over printouts, tracing the flow of execution, trying to understand where logic had gone wrong. Grace Hopper, working at Remington Rand, began developing what she called a compiler, a program that could translate more human-readable instructions into machine code. She believed that programmers shouldn't need to work at the level of individual machine instructions, that there should be a layer of abstraction, a way to write programs that described what you wanted to accomplish rather than exactly how the machine should do it. Her work led to Flowmatic, one of the first high-level programming languages, designed to look almost like English, to be readable by people who weren't electronics experts. This was revolutionary. The idea that you could write something like compare price to budget and have a compiler translate that into the dozens or hundreds of machine instructions needed to actually perform the comparison. It meant that programming could become more accessible, that business analysts could potentially write programs, that the bottleneck of having too few programmers might be eased. In 1957, an IBM team led by John Backus released Fortran, Formula Translation. Designed for scientific and engineering calculations, it allowed mathematicians to write programs using notation that looked like algebra, equations that the computer would solve, loops that would iterate through calculations, subroutines that could be called repeatedly. Suddenly, programming became less about managing the machine and more about expressing algorithms, about solving problems. The late 50s also saw the invention of the transistor becoming practical for computing. Transistors had been invented at Bell Labs in 1947, tiny semiconductor devices that could amplify or switch electronic signals, much smaller than vacuum tubes, much more reliable, consuming far less power, generating far less heat, but it took years to develop manufacturing techniques to make them cheap enough, reliable enough to replace tubes in computers. The first transistorized computers appeared in the late 1950s, machines that were dramatically smaller than their vacuum tube predecessors, that could run for days without component failures, that used a fraction of the power. The TX0 at MIT, built in 1956, demonstrated what was possible, and soon manufacturers were racing to build fully transistorized machines. The IBM 7090, the Control Data 1604, each generation smaller, faster, more reliable than the last, and then, quietly, another revolution was beginning at Texas Instruments and at Fairchild Semiconductor. Engineers were figuring out how to build not just individual transistors, but entire circuits on single pieces of silicon, the integrated circuit, multiple transistors and resistors and capacitors, all fabricated together on a chip smaller than a fingernail. Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments demonstrated the first working integrated circuit in September of 1958, and Robert Noyce at Fairchild developed a practical manufacturing process. Soon after, this changed the trajectory of everything, because integrated circuits meant that complexity no longer required physical size. You could pack more and more components into the same space, or make the same capability smaller and smaller. The room-sized computers of the 1950s could, in principle, eventually fit on a desk, or in a briefcase, or in a pocket. Through the 1960s, computing expanded in multiple directions at once. IBM released the System /360 in 1964, a family of computers that all used the same instruction set, the same software, but came in different sizes and speeds. A business could start with a smaller model and upgrade to a larger one without rewriting all their programs. This concept of compatibility, of a platform that could grow, was transformative for commercial computing. Meanwhile, time-sharing systems were being developed, ways to allow multiple users to interact with a single computer simultaneously, each user at their own terminal, a teletype machine or a CRT display, connected by cable or phone line to the central computer, which would rapidly switch between users, giving each one a slice of computing time, so fast that it felt like you had the machine to yourself. This made computing interactive for the first time. Instead of submitting a batch job and waiting hours for results, you could type a command and see the response immediately, have a conversation with the machine, explore ideas iteratively. At MIT, Project Mac, the multiple access computer, demonstrated time sharing at scale, Dozens of users connected to a single mainframe, each one running programs, editing text, compiling code, the system managing all the competing demands for memory and processor time. And from this emerged a culture of interactive computing, of terminals in offices and laboratories, of researchers who could test ideas quickly, who could develop software incrementally, seeing results as they worked rather than days later. The mini-computer revolution began in the mid-60s. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation building smaller, less expensive machines, not as powerful as IBM mainframes, but affordable for departments, for laboratories, for applications where a full mainframe was overkill, the PDP series, starting with the PDP-1 in 1960, then the PDP-8, which became the first mass-produced mini-computer, over 50,000 units sold, each one about the size of a refrigerator, costing thousands of dollars instead of millions, bringing computing within reach of universities, research groups, even some wealthy individuals. Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie at Bell Labs, working on a PDP-7 and later a PDP-11, developed Unix, an operating system that would influence computing for decades. Unix was elegant, built on simple principles. Everything is a file. Small tools that do one thing well and can be combined. A hierarchical file system. Text-based configuration. It was written partly in C, a programming language Ritchie developed, which made Unix portable, able to run on different hardware with relatively little modification, and Unix spread through universities, where students learned its philosophy, carried it with them into industry. The 1970s brought the microprocessor, Intel's 4004, released in 1971, a complete central processing unit on a single chip, designed originally for a calculator, but containing the essential elements of a computer: arithmetic logic, control logic, registers for temporary storage. It was a 4-bit processor capable of processing 4 binary digits at a time, not powerful by any measure, but it was a processor on a chip. And soon Intel released the 8008, then the 80808-bit processors that were powerful enough to build real computers around. And people began to do exactly that. Hobbyists, electronics enthusiasts, people who had never had access to computing before. The Altair 8800, released in 1975 as a kit, sold by mail order from MITS in Albuquerque. It had no keyboard, no display, just switches on the front panel to enter programs, lights to show the state of memory, but it had an Intel 8080 processor, and it cost less than $400. Suddenly, computing was accessible. You could own a computer in your home, learn it intimately, program it yourself. The Altair created a community. Clubs formed. The Homebrew Computer Club in Silicon Valley, where enthusiasts gathered to share designs, to show off their projects, to trade software. Bill Gates and Paul Allen wrote a version of BASIC for the Altair, one of the first programs available for it, and that BASIC interpreter became the foundation of their company. Microsoft. Software was becoming a product, not just something that came bundled with hardware, but something valuable in itself. Other computers followed. The Apple I, designed by Steve Wozniak, sold mostly to hobbyists. Then the Apple II in 1977, which was different. It came assembled in a plastic case with a keyboard. It could display color graphics on a television. It had expansion slots so users could add capabilities, disk drives, printer interfaces, modems, and it came with BASIC built into ROM. Turn it on, and you could start programming immediately. No need to load software from tape first. The Apple II became the first successful personal computer, selling millions of units over its production life, finding its way into homes, into schools, into small businesses. People used it for games, for education, for writing, for managing finances. For the first time, computing was something that individuals could own, could explore, could make part of their daily lives without needing institutional access or specialized training. Around the same time, Commodore released the PET. Tandy released the TRS-80, each offering their own vision of personal computing, and the software ecosystem began to grow. VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet program, released for the Apple II in 1979, transformed how people thought about personal computers. Suddenly, a computer wasn't just a toy or a curiosity. It was a tool that could save hours of work, that could model business scenarios, that could pay for itself in productivity. VisiCalc alone drove thousands of Apple II sales, people buying the hardware specifically to run that one program. The early 1980s saw computing become increasingly commercial, increasingly mainstream. IBM, which had dominated business computing with mainframes, entered the personal computer market in 1981 with the IBM PC. They designed it quickly using off-the-shelf components, an Intel 8088 processor, an open architecture that other companies could build hardware for, and crucially, they licensed the operating system MS-DOS from Microsoft rather than developing their own. This decision would have profound consequences because it meant that the operating system wasn't tied exclusively to IBM's hardware. Within months, other companies began producing IBM PC clones, compatible machines that could run the same software. Compaq, leading the way with a portable PC, then dozens of other manufacturers, each competing on price and features, but all running MS-DOS, all capable of running the growing library of PC software. Word processors like WordStar and later WordPerfect, spreadsheets like Lotus 123, databases like DBase. The PC became a platform, an ecosystem, and Microsoft, controlling the operating system, found itself at the center of that ecosystem. Meanwhile, Apple was pursuing a different vision. In 1984, they released the Macintosh, a computer built around a graphical user interface, windows, icons, a mouse pointer. The idea had been pioneered at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, where researchers had built experimental systems with graphical interfaces in the 1970s. But Apple brought it to the mass market, made it affordable, made it elegant. The Macintosh showed that computers didn't have to be intimidating, didn't require memorizing commands. You could point and click, drag and drop, see what you were doing represented visually on screen. The Mac struggled commercially at first. It was more expensive than PCs, had less software, but it found a devoted following among creative professionals, designers, publishers, educators, and it established that graphical interfaces were the future. Even Microsoft recognized this, spent years developing Windows, a graphical shell for MS-DOS, trying to match what Apple had achieved. The early versions were crude, but by Windows 3.1 in 1992, and especially Windows 95, the PC world had embraced the graphical paradigm that the Mac had pioneered. Through the 1980s, computers became faster, memory became cheaper, hard drives replaced floppy disks for storage, modems allowed computers to communicate over phone lines, bulletin board systems emerged, individuals running computers with phone lines connected, creating spaces where people could leave messages, share files, play games together. These were precursors to the internet, small networks, local communities, but they demonstrated the hunger for connection, for communication through computers. The internet itself, which had existed since the 1960s as ARPANET, a research network connecting universities and government facilities, began to open up, expand, new networks joined, protocols were standardized, TCP/IP became the common language by the late 1980s. The internet was no longer just for researchers, though it was still primarily text-based, email, news groups, FTP for file transfer, Telnet for remote login. You needed to know commands, understand protocols. But for those who learned, it offered a window into a global conversation, into resources scattered across continents. And then, in 1991, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN, the European Physics Laboratory, released the World Wide Web, a system for linking documents across the internet using hypertext. You could click on a link and jump to another document anywhere in the world. The first web browsers were simple, text-based, but they demonstrated the concept. And when Mosaic, a graphical web browser, was released in 1993, suddenly the web became accessible, visual. You could see images in line with text, navigate by clicking, browse without understanding the underlying technology. The web grew exponentially from a few hundred websites in 1993 to millions by the late 90s. Everyone wanted a presence online. Businesses, universities, individuals creating personal pages. Early search engines like Yahoo and later Google helped people navigate this expanding universe of information, and computing, which had been about calculation, about processing data, about running applications, became increasingly about connection, about communication, about accessing information stored on distant servers. The late 90s saw the rise of laptops as practical machines, no longer expensive curiosities, but genuine alternatives to desktop computers, portable computing, powerful enough to run the same software, thin and light enough to carry batteries that lasted hours, and wireless networking, first through cellular modems, then through Wi-Fi, meant that computing could happen anywhere, in coffee shops, in airports, in homes without network cables snaking through walls. The 2000s brought computing into daily life in ways that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. Social networking sites emerged. Friendster, MySpace, then Facebook, creating persistent online identities, networks of connections, streams of updates from friends and acquaintances. Computing became social, personal, integrated with human relationships and communication patterns. Search engines became portals to all human knowledge. Google's PageRank algorithm, launched in 1998, revolutionized how information was found, ranking pages by relevance and authority, making the web navigable later. Wikipedia, launched in 2001, demonstrated that collective knowledge creation could work, that thousands of volunteers could build an encyclopedia larger and more current than any printed reference, constantly updated, covering obscure topics alongside mainstream ones. Mobile phones, which had been simple communication devices, began incorporating computing power. Early smartphones like the BlackBerry focused on email, giving business users access to their messages anywhere, but the iPhone, released in 2007, reimagined what a mobile computer could be: a touchscreen interface, apps that could do almost anything: music, maps, games, photography, web browsing, all in a device that fit in a pocket. And the Android operating system, released soon after, brought similar capabilities to phones from dozens of manufacturers. Suddenly, computing was always available, always connected. People carried more processing power in their pockets than had filled rooms in the 1960s, and they used it constantly, checking email, browsing social media, navigating, photographing, messaging. Computing had dissolved into the fabric of daily life, become invisible through its ubiquity. Cloud computing emerged as major companies built massive data centers, server farms with thousands of machines, offering computing power and storage as a service. You didn't need to own a powerful computer anymore, could do intensive processing on remote servers, store files in the cloud, access them from any device. Computing became distributed, decentralized. Your phone, your laptop, your tablet, all windows into the same services, the same data, synchronized automatically. And through all these decades, from the enormous room-filling machines of the 1940s to the smartphones of the 21st century, one thing remained constant: the fundamental architecture that von Neumann described: processor, memory, storage, input, output. The principles remained the same even as the implementation changed beyond recognition, from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to microprocessors with billions of transistors, from mercury delay lines to magnetic cores to silicon chips storing gigabytes, from punched cards to magnetic tape to hard drives to solid-state storage. The underlying concepts persisted, evolved, but never completely disappeared. And now, as we sit here in the glow of screens, in a world where computing is everywhere, in our phones and watches, in our cars and homes, in the infrastructure that powers cities, in the satellites orbiting overhead, it's worth remembering that quiet progression, that accumulation of ideas and innovations, each generation building on what came before, solving new problems, opening new possibilities. The remarkable thing about this history, this long arc from mechanical calculators to quantum computers being developed today, is how much of it was driven by human needs that never changed: the need to count, to remember, to communicate, to solve problems that exceeded the capacity of individual minds. What changed was the medium, the speed, the scale, but the fundamental impulse remained constant. There's a certain poetry in how computing evolved, how each breakthrough made possible by the last. Transistors couldn't have been integrated into circuits without understanding gained from building vacuum tube computers. Microprocessors couldn't have been designed without the accumulated knowledge of how processors worked at larger scales. The internet couldn't have grown without personal computers to connect. And those personal computers needed decades of miniaturization before they could sit on desks instead of filling rooms. And through it all, Through every generation of technology, there were people, individuals with names and lives and struggles, who saw possibilities that others missed, who persisted through failures and setbacks, who built on each other's work, sometimes with credit, sometimes without. The women who programmed ENIAC, whose contributions went unrecognized for decades. The engineers at small companies who competed with giants. The hobbyists who believed that computing should belong to everyone, not just corporations and governments. Consider the languages that emerged, each one a different philosophy about how humans and machines should communicate. Fortran saying that programmers should think mathematically. COBOL arguing for business-readable code. C prioritizing efficiency and direct hardware access. Later languages like Python emphasizing readability and ease of learning. Each language embedded assumptions about what mattered, what problems were worth solving, how programmers should think, and the arguments that raged, debates that seemed technical but reflected deeper values, open source versus proprietary software, whether code should be freely shared or carefully protected, whether computing power should be centralized in data centers or distributed to individual devices, whether privacy or convenience should take precedence when those values conflicted. These weren't just technical questions, they were philosophical ones, about ownership, about control, about what kind of world we wanted to build with these powerful tools. The speed of change itself became a defining characteristic. Moore's law, the observation that the number of transistors on a chip doubled roughly every 2 years, held true for decades, meant that computers became exponentially more powerful. That last year's breakthrough became this year's baseline, became next year's obsolescence. People who learned to program on one generation of machines found their knowledge outdated within years, had to continuously adapt, learn new languages, new paradigms, new ways of thinking about problems. And yet some things persisted. Some programs written in the 1960s still run today, maintaining critical infrastructure, banking systems, air traffic control, because the cost and risk of replacing them exceeds the benefit. So modern programmers sometimes find themselves working with COBOL, with systems designed before they were born, maintaining bridges between past and present, ensuring continuity even as everything else changes. The story of computing is also a story about abstraction, about creating layers that hide complexity. Early programmers worked with machine code, ones and zeros, then came assembly language, symbolic names for operations, then high-level languages, then frameworks and libraries, each layer making it easier to build more complex things, allowing programmers to think at higher levels, to compose solutions from pre-built components, standing on ever taller towers of accumulated code. But abstraction has costs. Fewer people understand the lower levels, how data actually moves through circuits, how operating systems manage resources, how networks route packets. We build on foundations we don't fully understand, trust that the layers below us work correctly, and mostly they do. But when something breaks at a deep level, when a security flaw is discovered in fundamental protocols, when hardware behaves unexpectedly, the specialists who understand those depths become invaluable, keepers of knowledge that seems almost arcane. There's something dreamlike about the pace of transformation. Someone born when ENIAC was being built in the mid-1940s has lived through the entire computer age, from room-sized calculators to artificial intelligence, from punch cards to voice interfaces, from computers as rare institutional resources to computers as ubiquitous personal devices. The world they were born into and the world they inhabit now are almost unrecognizable to each other, and all of this change, this revolution, happened within a single human lifetime, and the changes continue, accelerating, if anything. Quantum computers beginning to demonstrate capabilities that classical computers struggle with. Artificial intelligence systems learning to perform tasks that seemed uniquely human, generate text, create images, drive cars, diagnose diseases. The boundaries of what machines can do keep expanding, pushing into territories we once thought belonged exclusively to human intelligence. But perhaps the most profound change is how computing has become invisible, woven so thoroughly into daily life that we barely notice it. The phone in your pocket contains millions of times more processing power than the computers that guided Apollo to the moon. And you use it to check messages, to share photos, to navigate, to listen to music. Computing has become infrastructure, like electricity or running water, something we depend on without thinking about, until it stops working. The story circles back to those early dreams of mechanical calculation, to Babbage imagining engines of brass and iron, to Turing conceiving of universal machines, to the programmers setting switches on ENIAC. They were all reaching toward something, a vision of machines that could extend human capability, that could remember perfectly, calculate tirelessly, process information at scales beyond human capacity. And we've achieved that vision, exceeded it, built systems more complex and capable than those pioneers could have imagined. And yet, the fundamental questions remain: what should we do with this power? How do we ensure that computing serves human flourishing? How do we preserve privacy and autonomy in a world of constant connection? How do we prevent the tools we've built from amplifying our worst impulses along with our best? These aren't technical questions, they're human ones, and they require the same careful thought, the same patient problem solving, the same willingness to learn from mistakes that built the technology in the first place. Tonight, in this quiet moment, with the story told, we can appreciate the long journey, the countless innovations, the accumulated wisdom that brought us from mechanical gears to quantum bits, from rooms full of vacuum tubes to chips smaller than fingernails, from calculations that took days to computations that happen in nanoseconds. It's a story of human ingenuity, of collaboration across generations, of dreams made real through patient effort. And the story isn't finished, will never be finished, because each solution creates new problems. Each capability enables new questions. Each generation builds on what came before and reaches toward what comes next. The computers of tomorrow will seem as magical to us as today's smartphones would seem to those ENIAC programmers. And yet they'll be built on the same foundations, the same principles, the same human desire to understand, to calculate, to remember, to connect. So we let the story settle like dust after a long journey. And in the settling, we can see the path we've traveled, the distance we've come, the ingenuity and persistence required at every step, from the first mechanical calculators to the quantum computers being developed in laboratories today. It's all one continuous thread, one unfolding story, one long conversation between human minds and the machines they've built to extend their reach. The lights in the server rooms keep blinking. The electrons keep flowing through circuits. The data keeps moving through networks. And somewhere, someone is writing code, solving a problem, building something new, continuing the work, adding their contribution to this endless unfolding, this quiet revolution that began with gears and now encompasses the world. And in that ongoing work, in that patient building, there's something almost meditative, something that connects us to all those who came before, who sat at their desks and drawing boards, who soldered circuits and debugged code, who imagined possibilities and worked to make them real. The story continues, will always continue, as long as there are problems to solve, questions to answer, dreams to pursue, through circuits and silicon, through light and electricity, through the endless patient work of making machines think. The hum of the computers fades, becomes background, becomes silence, and in that silence the story rests, complete for now, but never truly finished, waiting for the next chapter, the next innovation, the next dreamer who will push the boundaries a little further, and the work goes on quietly, persistently, one calculation at a time. I imagine a theater in twilight, not a grand modern hall with bright marquees and bustling crowds, but something older, something quieter, a space where wooden beams creak softly overhead and dust motes drift through shafts of fading light, filtering down from high windows that haven't been cleaned in decades, perhaps centuries. The air here feels different, heavier somehow, as though it holds the memory of every voice that ever echoed from its stage, every whispered line, every grand soliloquy, every moment of revelation that passed between the players and those who came to witness. Outside these walls, the world continues its endless turning, but here, in this particular pocket of existence, time seems to move at a different pace entirely, moving through layers of history like fingers trailing through water, touching briefly on moments that shaped how we see ourselves, how we understand the human experience through the strange alchemy of performance. There's something almost sacred about an empty theater, the way shadows pool in the corners of the stage, the way a single candle or lantern can transform bare boards into any place imaginable, a palace in Denmark, a forest outside Athens, the streets of Verona, where ancient grudges breed new mutiny. I find myself thinking about the people who made these transformations possible, not the actors alone, though they were essential, but the ones who put words into their mouths, who dreamed entire worlds into being with nothing but language and imagination, the playwrights who understood that theater was more than entertainment, that it was a mirror held up to nature, a way of examining what it means to be alive. They worked in different eras, different countries, under different circumstances entirely, some writing for kings and queens in candle-lit chambers, others for groundlings standing in the mud of outdoor playhouses, still others for drawing rooms where polite society gathered to see itself reflected, sometimes flattered, sometimes challenged, always observed. These writers understood something fundamental about human nature, that we are creatures who need stories, who gather around fires or footlights to hear our own experiences transformed into something larger, something that resonates beyond the particular and into the universal. I think about how a playwright's work differs from other forms of writing. A novel can luxuriate in description, can slip inside a character's thoughts and remain there for pages, painting interior landscapes with exquisite detail. But a play must live entirely in dialogue and action, in what can be seen and heard, what can be embodied by human beings, standing before other human beings in shared space. This limitation became in the hands of masters, not a constraint, but a kind of freedom, forcing them to distill human experience down to its essence, to find ways of revealing character through speech and gesture alone, to trust that an audience would lean forward in their seats and fill in what couldn't be shown, participating in the creation of meaning. The greatest of these writers developed distinct voices, recognizable styles that set them apart, yet they all shared certain qualities, an understanding of dramatic structure, of how tension builds and releases, of when to offer comic relief and when to press deeper into tragedy, of how a single line, perfectly placed, can illuminate an entire character or shift the direction of a story completely. Some of them changed the very language we speak, coined phrases that outlived their plays and became part of everyday conversation, proof that a theater, when done well, doesn't remain confined to the stage, but seeps out into the world, shaping how we think and express ourselves generations later. Others revolutionized theatrical form itself, broke conventions that seemed unbreakable, showed that plays could be longer or shorter, funnier or darker, more realistic or more abstract than anyone had imagined, each innovation opening doors for those who followed. I imagine these figures now, separated by centuries and continents, yet connected by their shared craft, by their dedication to capturing human truth in dramatic form. And I wonder what it was like for each of them, sitting alone with quill or pen, watching characters come alive on the page, hearing voices that no one else could hear yet, voices that would soon fill theaters and echo down through time. The theater in my mind grows darker now, the last light fading from those high windows, but there's a kind of beauty in this dimness, the way it allows imagination to take over completely, the way a bare stage becomes infinite, capable of containing any story, any world, any vision that a playwright dares to dream into existence. The story begins, as so many stories do, in ancient Greece, where theater itself was born from religious festivals honoring Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy and transformation, where entire communities gathered on hillsides carved into natural amphitheaters, stone seats rising in perfect semicircles to hold thousands of citizens who came to witness something sacred. In those early days, around the 5th century before the Common Era, drama was not mere entertainment, but civic duty, a way for the city-state to examine itself, to grapple with questions of justice and fate, and the relationship between mortals and gods. And 3 names emerge from this distant time, like pillars supporting everything that would come after. Aeschylus, the first whose works survive, a man who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, who had seen the Persian Wars reshape the Greek world, brought that experience of conflict and consequence to the stage, creating tragedies that explored how human choices ripple outward, how the sins of fathers fall upon children, how justice, when pursued too zealously, can become indistinguishable from revenge. His plays were grand affairs, employing only 2 actors plus a chorus. Yet within those constraints he built monuments of dramatic art. The Oresteia remains the only complete trilogy we possess from ancient Greece. 3 plays that trace a curse through generations, from Agamemnon's murder by his wife Clytemnestra, to their son Orestes' terrible choice between avenging his father and sparing his mother, to the final resolution in an Athenian court where human law replaces the endless cycle of blood vengeance. Aeschylus understood that theater could hold vast ideas, could make visible the invisible forces that shape human destiny. His choruses spoke in language that was dense and poetic, often difficult even for ancient audiences, but that difficulty was intentional, demanding that spectators work to extract meaning, to engage actively with the moral questions being posed. Then came Sophocles, younger, more interested in the psychology of individuals than in cosmic justice. He added a 3rd actor to the stage, allowing for more complex interactions, more nuanced revelations of character. And he wrote, by ancient accounts, over 120 plays, though only 7 complete tragedies survived the centuries. Among these, Oedipus Rex stands as perhaps the most perfectly constructed drama in Western literature, a story everyone in the audience already knew, the tale of a man who killed his father and married his mother, yet Sophocles made them feel every moment of discovery as though it were new, building tension through dramatic irony, through the terrible gap between what the audience knows and what Oedipus believes. The play moves with the inevitability of a mathematical proof. Each attempt Oedipus makes to escape his fate only draws him closer to the truth he's fleeing. Each witness he calls to prove his innocence instead confirms his guilt, until finally he stands alone, self-blinded, exiled, transformed from the solver of riddles who saved Thebes to a riddle himself, a warning about the limits of human knowledge and the dangers of hubris. Sophocles wrote with grace and clarity, his language less ornate than Aeschylus, but no less powerful, finding beauty in simplicity, creating characters who felt fully human even as they moved through mythic narratives. His Antigone, defying her uncle's edict to leave her brother's body unburied, remains one of literature's great portraits of moral courage, of choosing divine law over human authority, even when it means certain death. The 3rd great tragedian was Euripides, the youngest of this triumvirate, and the most controversial, a playwright who questioned everything his predecessors had established, who took the old myths and twisted them, showing the gods as petty and cruel, heroes as flawed and selfish, women as complex beings with inner lives and valid grievances against a male-dominated society. His Medea shocked Athenian audiences, presenting a foreign woman, a barbarian by Greek standards, as the play's center, giving her eloquent speeches about the injustices women endure, then showing her commit the ultimate transgression, murdering her own children to punish her unfaithful husband Jason. Euripides didn't ask his audience to approve of Medea's actions, but he forced them to understand the rage that drove her, to see her not as a monster, but as a human being pushed beyond endurance. The Bacchae, possibly his final play, returned to Dionysus, the god in whose honor these dramas were performed, but presented him as a force of terrifying power, capable of driving mortals mad, of making mothers tear their own sons apart in ecstatic frenzy. It was a warning, perhaps, about the dangers of denying the irrational aspects of human nature, of pretending reason alone could govern our lives. These three men, writing within decades of each other, established tragedy as an art form, created works that would be studied and imitated and argued over for millennia. But they weren't alone on the Athenian stage. Comedy flourished there as well, and one name dominates the comedic tradition of that era, Aristophanes, whose plays were raucous and obscene and politically pointed, filled with talking animals and flying heroes and gods brought low. He used the freedom of comedy to attack public figures by name, to mock Athens's military adventures, to propose absurd solutions to real problems. In Lysistrata, the women of Greece end the Peloponnesian War by refusing to sleep with their husbands until peace is declared, a premise that allowed for endless bawdy jokes while making a serious point about the senselessness of perpetual conflict. His comedy was physical, verbal, often crude by modern standards, but beneath the laughs lay sharp social commentary. The clouds mocked Socrates and the new sophistic education. The frogs descended into the underworld to judge a contest between Aeschylus and Euripides, between old and new styles of tragedy. Aristophanes himself clearly preferring the grand moral certainties of Aeschylus to what he saw as Euripides' corrosive questioning. These Greek playwrights worked within strict formal constraints, the chorus that never left the stage, the limitation on actors, the requirement that violence happen off stage and be reported rather than shown, the unity of time and action that kept plays focused and intense. Yet within these boundaries they achieved extraordinary range, from the cosmic scale of Prometheus Bound, with its titan chained to a rock for stealing fire from the gods, to the intimate domestic tragedy of Euripides' Alcestis, where a wife agrees to die in her husband's place. They wrote for specific occasions, the dramatic festivals where playwrights competed for prizes, where wealthy citizens funded productions as a form of public service, where attendance was not just entertainment, but religious observance and civic participation. The theater held the entire community, rich and poor, citizens and foreigners, though not in those early days, women, who were represented on stage by male actors in masks, but not permitted to watch or perform. The plays themselves were performed only once or rarely, making each performance a unique event. There were no permanent records, no way to experience a drama except by being present when it was staged, which gave the theater an urgency, an immediacy that's difficult to imagine in our age of recordings and revivals. And then, for centuries, the tradition seemed to die. Rome produced playwrights like Seneca, who adapted Greek tragedies, making them more violent, more rhetorical, but these were likely closet dramas, meant for reading rather than performance. And Plautus and Terence wrote comedies based on Greek New Comedy, domestic farces about mistaken identities and young lovers. But nothing matched the achievement of Athens' Golden Age. The medieval period saw theater reborn from religious ritual, mystery plays that dramatized biblical stories, morality plays that personified virtues and vices, performed in churches and town squares, anonymous works, collective creations rather than the vision of individual playwrights, fascinating in their own right, but not yet what we think of as authored drama, as literature meant for the stage. The Renaissance would change everything, would see theater explode across Europe in new forms. but that transformation was still centuries away, and the Greek playwrights remained, their works preserved in manuscripts, studied by scholars, waiting for the moment when theater would rise again. That moment arrived in England in the late 16th century, when London was transforming from a medieval city into something more complex, more cosmopolitan, a place where theaters were being built for the first time as permanent structures, not temporary stages in inn-yards or noble houses, but dedicated spaces where plays could be performed daily, where audiences could gather by the hundreds, standing in the pit or sitting in the galleries, drawn by the promise of stories both familiar and strange. The theaters themselves were architectural marvels in their own right, circular or polygonal wooden structures, open to the sky, with a stage that thrust out into the crowd, creating an intimacy between performers and spectators. No barrier of orchestra pit or proscenium arch, just bodies breathing the same air, sharing the same afternoon light, the same sudden darkness when clouds passed overhead. Christopher Marlowe arrived in this world like a comet, burning bright and brief, a shoemaker's son who went to Cambridge on scholarship, who may have worked as a spy, who certainly lived wildly, wrote urgently, and died violently in a tavern brawl at 29, stabbed through the eye under circumstances that remain disputed, his killer claiming self-defense, some historians suspecting political assassination, but before that end, Marlowe revolutionized English drama. He took the rigid lines of earlier plays, their mechanical rhythms and predictable rhymes, and unleashed what Ben Jonson would later call Marlowe's mighty line, blank verse that rolled and thundered, that could contain enormous ideas and fierce passions, that made language itself a kind of action. His Tamburlaine, the great, presented a shepherd who conquers the known world through sheer force of will, speaking in poetry that matched his ambition, vast and glittering and relentless. Marlowe didn't apologize for his protagonist's cruelty or try to moralize his violence. He simply showed power in its most naked form, and audiences were electrified. They had never heard anything like this on an English stage. Dr. Faustus followed, the story of a scholar who sells his soul to the devil for 24 years of supernatural power. And Marlowe made those years feel simultaneously endless and fleeting, filled with conjuring tricks and theological debates, with comedy and horror intertwined, until the final scene when Faustus faces damnation, when the clock strikes midnight and demons come to collect their prize, and he delivers one of drama's most harrowing speeches, begging time to slow, to stop, to give him just one more moment of existence before he's dragged to hell. The Jew of Malta and Edward II showed different facets of Marlowe's genius, his ability to create complex villains who were more interesting than virtuous characters, his willingness to depict forbidden desires, homoerotic love and religious hypocrisy and political machinations, all rendered in language that made the transgressive seem inevitable, even necessary. Marlowe died in 1593, just as another playwright was beginning to overshadow him. Though the two may have collaborated, may have been rivals, may have been friends, the historical record preserves so little about their relationship. But William Shakespeare, born the same year as Marlowe, would take what Marlowe had begun and build something even more extraordinary. Shakespeare came from Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town in Warwickshire. his father a glover and local official who fell on hard times. William married young Anne Hathaway, 8 years his senior, already pregnant when they wed. 3 children followed. And then, somehow, Shakespeare made his way to London, joined a theater company, began acting, began writing. The early plays show him learning his craft, imitating Marlowe's grand style, writing histories about English kings that were really commentaries on contemporary politics, exploring how power corrupts, how civil war tears nations apart, how leadership requires both strength and wisdom. Richard III gave audiences a villain protagonist who reveled in his own evil, soliloquizing directly to the crowd, making them complicit in his schemes even as they were horrified by his actions. Romeo and Juliet took a familiar Italian tale and made it achingly immediate. 2 teenagers falling in love across a family feud, speaking to each other in shared sonnets. Their romance doomed not by fate alone, but by the stupidity of adults who refused to end their meaningless grudge. The play balanced poetry and violence, comedy and tragedy, Mercutio's wit and the nurse's earthiness grounding the lovers' idealism, making their deaths feel like a waste, a preventable tragedy that shames everyone who survives them. A Midsummer Night's Dream showed Shakespeare's gift for comedy, for weaving multiple plots together, aristocratic lovers fleeing to the forest, where fairy royalty quarrels over a stolen child, where a group of craftsmen rehearses a play, and magic turns a weaver into a donkey. And by morning, nothing is quite as it was, except that it is the chaos resolved, the marriages arranged, everything returned to order, but with a sense that the wildness of the wood is always there, just beyond the city walls, waiting. Then came the great tragedies, the period when Shakespeare seemed to peer into the darkest corners of human experience and emerge with works of devastating beauty. Hamlet, the prince who cannot decide whether to avenge his father's murder, who questions everything, the nature of death, the purpose of life, the reliability of ghosts, and the trustworthiness of uncles, who stages a play within the play to catch the conscience of the king, who accidentally kills the wrong man and drives Ophelia mad with grief, who finally acts only when it's too late, when everyone he loves is dead or dying. The play is impossibly long, probably never performed in full, even in Shakespeare's time, yet every scene feels necessary. Every speech reveals something new about its speaker. Hamlet himself is somehow both a specific character and a mirror. Audiences see themselves in his doubts, his delays, his sudden violence, his bitter jokes, and his genuine grief. Othello presented jealousy as a kind of poison, introduced drop by Iago, the ensign who resents being passed over for promotion and so destroys everyone around him. Shakespeare made Othello a Moor, nay, an outsider in Venetian society, a military hero who never quite belongs, whose marriage to Desdemona is questioned by her father, by the state, by Othello himself, once Iago begins whispering suggestions, intimations, possibilities that grow into certainties despite having no foundation. The tragedy unfolds with mechanical precision, each piece falling into place until Othello smothers his innocent wife and then, learning the truth, kills himself rather than live with what he's done. King Lear stripped away everything comfortable, presented an old king dividing his kingdom among his daughters, disowning the one who truly loves him, rewarding the two who flatter him with false declarations, and then, when those two daughters betray him, casting him out into a storm. The play descended into something primal, Lear raging on the heath, accompanied by a fool who speaks truth through riddles, by a nobleman disguised as a beggar. The social order collapsed entirely, left only suffering and madness, and occasional moments of tenderness between characters who had nothing left to lose. Macbeth explored ambition, how a brave warrior, hearing a prophecy that he'll be a king, allows that possibility to consume him, encouraged by his wife, who is even more ambitious, more willing to push past moral boundaries. They murder the sleeping king, seize the throne, then discover that power gained through murder must be maintained through more murders, until Macbeth becomes the tyrant he once fought against, until Lady Macbeth, who seemed so strong, is destroyed by guilt, walking in her sleep, trying to wash invisible blood from her hands, until the prophecy completes itself in ways they never anticipated. These plays were performed in daylight, with minimal scenery, the words creating every setting, every mood, actors speaking directly to the audience, making them confidants and witnesses. The Globe Theatre, where Shakespeare's company performed, held perhaps 3,000 people, merchants and apprentices and nobles all mixed together, eating nuts and drinking ale, heckling or cheering, demanding their money back if they were disappointed. Shakespeare wrote for these audiences, for their taste for violence and comedy mixed together, for their love of wordplay, puns, and double meanings that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. He wrote for specific actors, too. We can trace through his plays how his company's personnel changed, how a new boy actor inspired him to write more complex female roles, how the company clown's style evolved from improvised physical comedy to scripted philosophical banter. But he also wrote for something larger, some ideal audience that existed in his imagination, capable of following the most intricate metaphors, of catching subtle echoes between scenes separated by acts, of holding contradictory ideas in tension. His plays refuse easy interpretation. Shylock in The Merchant of Venice is both villain and victim. His famous speech claiming common humanity with Christians is genuinely moving, even as the play itself seems ambivalent about whether he deserves mercy or punishment. The late romances, Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale and The Tempest, showed Shakespeare experimenting with form, mixing tragedy and comedy in new ways, allowing for reconciliation rather than death, for forgiveness rather than revenge. The Tempest, possibly his final solo work, presented Prospero, the wronged duke, marooned on an island where he's learned magic, where he controls spirits, where he finally has the chance to punish his enemies when they're shipwrecked on his shore. But instead, after putting them through trials, he chooses mercy, chooses to break his staff and drown his book, to return to the human world and its limitations. Shakespeare died in 1616, on his birthday according to tradition, having written, by most counts, 37 plays, plus sonnets and longer poems, works that were performed but not always published in his lifetime, gathered into the first folio 7 years after his death by fellow actors who wanted to preserve what might otherwise have been lost. The generation that follows Shakespeare continued exploring what drama could be, what it could say about human nature and society. Ben Jonson, who had been an actor and a soldier, who killed a man in a duel and escaped hanging by pleading benefit of clergy, brought classical learning to the English stage, wrote comedies that were more structured, more satirical than Shakespeare's, concerned with exposing human folly through precisely observed types. His Volpone presented a wealthy Venetian pretending to be dying, watching as greedy men offer him gifts and flatter him, hoping to be named his heir, each one degrading himself further, willing to sacrifice family, honor, dignity for the promise of gold. Jonson made vice entertaining even as he condemned it. His characters spoke in language that was dense and witty, packed with classical allusions, demonstrating that comedy could be as intellectually demanding as tragedy. The alchemist trapped 3 con artists in a house during a plague, where they bilked customers seeking the philosopher's stone, sexual satisfaction, advantageous marriages, whatever fantasy each mark desired. The plot grew more complex with each scene, lies building on lies, until the structure collapsed in glorious chaos. Jonson understood that comedy came from watching intelligent people construct elaborate schemes that fall apart through their own cleverness. John Webster wrote tragedies that were darker, more violent than even Shakespeare had attempted. The Duchess of Malfi presented a widow who dared to remarry below her station, who was tortured by her brothers for this transgression, driven mad by being shown wax figures of her murdered children, yet maintaining her dignity even as she was strangled. Webster's world was one where virtue offered no protection, where the innocent suffered alongside the guilty, where death came arbitrarily and often. The White Devil explored similar territory, adultery and murder among Italian nobility, characters who were neither purely good nor purely evil, but complex mixtures of desire and conscience. Webster wrote in images that were startling, visceral. His characters spoke of death and corruption in language that made those abstractions feel immediate, tangible, present in the theater like a fourth wall pressing in on the audience. These Jacobean playwrights, writing after Elizabeth's death, when James I took the throne, seemed drawn to darkness, to exposing the rot beneath civilized surfaces. John Ford's "'Tis pity she's a whore" confronted incest between brother and sister. Thomas Middleton's The Revenger's tragedy reveled in elaborate schemes of vengeance. The theater became a place where forbidden subjects could be examined, where social criticism could hide behind historical settings or foreign locations. But then, in 1642, Parliament closed all the theaters, the Puritan government viewing drama as immoral, corrupting, a distraction from godly living. For 18 years, an entire generation, there were no public performances in England, no new plays written for the stage. Actors fled to the continent or found other work. Theaters fell into disrepair or were demolished. When the theaters reopened after the Restoration, when Charles II returned from exile in 1660, everything had changed. The new playhouses were indoor spaces, candle-lit, with painted scenery and artificial perspective, with women performing female roles for the first time on English stages. The plays themselves were different, too. Comedies of manners that satirized fashionable society, heroic dramas in rhymed couplets that now seem stilted, but then represented the height of sophistication. William Wycherley and William Congreve wrote comedies about rakish aristocrats and clever women, about marriage as a social contract rather than romantic union. The Country Wife and The Way of the World sparkled with wit, characters trading elaborate insults and testing each other's intelligence through wordplay. But beneath the surface charm lay genuine cynicism about human relationships, about the games people played to secure money and status. Across the Channel, France had developed its own dramatic tradition. Pierre Corneille wrote tragedies that explored duty and honor. Le Cid presented a hero torn between love and obligation, between his heart and his principles. The play caused enormous controversy. Critics argued it violated neoclassical rules about unity of time and place, about moral instruction. Corneille defended his work, sparked debates about the purpose of theater that raged for years. Jean Racine perfected the French classical style, writing tragedies that were spare, elegant, focused on psychological suffering rather than external action. Phèdre, his masterpiece, presented a woman consumed by illicit passion for her stepson, fighting against her desires, knowing they were wrong, unable to stop herself. The play unfolded with the inevitability of Greek tragedy, but in language that was purely French, Alexandrine verse that seemed both natural and elevated. Molière brought comedy to heights it hadn't reached since Aristophanes, writing and acting in his own plays, creating satires that targeted religious hypocrisy, medical quackery, social climbing, aristocratic pretension. Tartuffe presented a con man posing as a holy man, taking over a household through his supposed piety, seducing the master's wife while denouncing pleasure and preaching abstinence. The play was banned for years, religious authorities claiming it mocked faith itself, though Molière insisted he only mocked those who used faith as a mask. The misanthrope created a protagonist who couldn't stand human dishonesty, who insisted on brutal honesty in all situations, making himself miserable and everyone around him uncomfortable. Molière showed that virtue taken to extremes became vice, that society required some degree of politeness, of white lies and social lubrication. His comedies were physical and verbal simultaneously, pratfalls and witty dialogue combined. He understood that laughter came from recognition, from seeing our own flaws magnified on stage. The 18th century saw theater spread and transform further. In England, Richard Brinsley Sheridan wrote The School for Scandal, a comedy about gossip and reputation that remains sparkling entertainment. Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer played with mistaken identities and class assumptions. These were lighter works than the Restoration comedies, more good-natured, less cynical about human nature. But the most significant theatrical development of that century happened in Germany, where Gotthold Ephraim Lessing argued for a new kind of drama, one that wasn't bound by French neoclassical rules, that could learn from Shakespeare's freedom, his mixing of comedy and tragedy, his willingness to span years and continents within a single play. Lessing wrote Nathan the Wise, a plea for religious tolerance, set in Jerusalem during the Crusades, presenting Muslim, Christian, and Jewish characters as equally capable of wisdom and folly. Friedrich Schiller took up this call, writing historical dramas that were epic in scope. The Robbers presented two brothers, one noble and idealistic, one scheming and corrupt. Don Carlos explored political intrigue in the Spanish court, religious persecution, forbidden love. Schiller wrote in language that was grand, rhetorical, designed to stir audiences to think about freedom and justice and human dignity. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, primarily known as a poet and novelist, wrote Faust, a dramatic poem in two parts that was perhaps never meant to be fully staged, too long, too complex, too cosmic in its ambitions. It took the old legend of the scholar who sold his soul and expanded it into an exploration of everything, knowledge and power, love and politics, art and commerce, redemption and damnation. Goethe worked on it for 60 years, from his youth into old age, and it remains a monument of world literature even if it defies conventional theatrical production. The 19th century brought new movements, new ideas about what theater should be. Romanticism emphasized emotion over reason, individual experience over social convention. Victor Hugo in France wrote Hernani, a play whose opening night sparked riots between classical and romantic factions, audiences fighting in the aisles over questions of dramatic form, whether theater should maintain neoclassical decorum or embrace Shakespeare's expansiveness. But the most radical change came with realism, the idea that plays should show life as it actually was, not heightened or poeticized, but mundane, contemporary, dealing with problems ordinary people faced. Henrik Ibsen in Norway pioneered this approach. His early work was poetic, historical, but then he turned to prose drama, to living rooms, and current social issues. A Doll's House shocked audiences across Europe, presented a wife and mother who walked out on her family, realizing her marriage was a lie, that she'd been treated as a doll, a plaything, not a full human being. The play ended with the door slamming, Nora leaving, and audiences didn't know what to make of it. Some theaters changed the ending, had Nora stay, couldn't accept that a woman would abandon her children. But Ibsen insisted on his vision. The play sparked debates about marriage, women's rights, individual freedom versus social duty. Ghosts went further, dealt with inherited disease, suggested that venereal illness could be passed to children, mentioned topics polite society refused to acknowledge. The play was banned, called obscene, disgusting, immoral. But Ibsen had opened a door that couldn't be closed, had shown that theater could confront contemporary problems directly, could make audiences uncomfortable, could challenge rather than simply entertain. Anton Chekhov in Russia took realism in a different direction, wrote plays where almost nothing happened. The Cherry Orchard presented a family losing their estate, knowing it would be sold, unable to do anything about it, talking endlessly, planning, dreaming, but never acting. The estate was sold, the cherry orchard cut down, and everyone scattered, disappointed but somehow accepting. Chekhov called it a comedy. Others saw it as tragedy. Perhaps it was both, or neither, simply life as it unfolded, without dramatic climaxes or clear resolutions. The Three Sisters, Uncle Vanya, plays where characters yearned for meaning, for Moscow, for work that mattered, for love that would transform their lives, but none of it came, or it came too late, or it came and turned out to be disappointing. Chekhov captured something essential about human experience, the way we live in hope, even when experience teaches us that hope is often disappointed, the way small moments of connection sustain us through long stretches of routine and frustration. His characters talked past each other, said one thing while meaning another, fell silent at crucial moments, behaved in ways that contradicted their stated intentions, and in doing so felt more real than the clearly motivated characters of traditional drama. Chekhov showed that theater didn't need grand gestures or momentous decisions, That ordinary life contained its own drama if you looked closely enough, if you could capture the rhythms of actual human interaction. George Bernard Shaw in England used the stage as a pulpit, wrote plays that were really arguments, essays disguised as drama, about economics, about war, about language and class and gender roles. Pygmalion presented a phonetics professor who taught a flower girl to speak like a duchess, proving that class distinctions were artificial, matters of accent and manners rather than inherent worth. Shaw filled his plays with long speeches, debates where characters articulated opposing philosophies. He didn't trust audiences to extract the moral themselves, so he included lengthy prefaces explaining exactly what he meant, what conclusions they should draw. Major Barbara explored poverty and morality through the story of a Salvation Army officer whose father was an arms manufacturer. St. Joan presented the French heroine as a proto-Protestant, a rational thinker ahead of her time. Shaw admired her independence even as he showed why the church and state had to destroy her. His plays were intellectual, provocative, sometimes more interesting to read than to watch, but they expanded the territory drama could claim, proved that theater could engage with ideas as directly as essays or novels. August Strindberg in Sweden moved in another direction entirely, wrote plays that were intense, claustrophobic, focused on the war between men and women. Miss Julie presented A Midsummer Night when class barriers broke down, when an aristocratic woman seduced her father's valet, destroying both of them. Strindberg wrote in his preface about naturalism, about showing characters as products of their heredity and environment, but the play itself felt more primal, more mythic than any simple naturalistic description suggested. His later work became expressionistic, dreamlike. The Ghost Sonata moved through a house where nothing was as it seemed, where characters revealed themselves in fragments, where the boundary between living and dead grew uncertain. Strindberg showed that theater could externalize internal states, could make visible the psychological demons that haunted us, could abandon realism entirely in pursuit of deeper truths. The 20th century saw these various strands continue, diverge, combine in unexpected ways. Bertolt Brecht rejected the idea that audiences should identify with characters, should lose themselves in the story. He wanted alienation, wanted spectators to maintain critical distance, to think rather than feel. His plays included songs that commented on the action, direct addresses to the audience, placards announcing what would happen next, anything to prevent emotional absorption. Mother Courage and her children followed a woman through the 30 Years' War, showing how she profited from conflict while losing all 3 of her children to it. The play was set in the past, but commented on the present, on how capitalism and war fed each other, on how ordinary people collaborated in their own oppression. Brecht wanted audiences to leave the theater and change the world, to recognize that social conditions weren't natural or inevitable, but constructed, capable of being transformed. Samuel Beckett stripped theater down to its essentials, Waiting for Godot presented 2 men waiting for someone who never came. They talked, they argued, they considered leaving, but stayed. A boy arrived twice to say Godot wouldn't come today, but would come tomorrow. And that was essentially the entire play. No plot in any traditional sense, no character development, no resolution. Yet somehow it was funny, profound. It captured something about existence itself, about how we fill time, how we create meaning through repetition and routine, how we keep hoping despite all evidence that hope is futile. Endgame was even more minimal. 4 characters in a room, 2 in ashcans, unable to move, talking because silence was unbearable, because language was all they had left. Beckett's stage directions were precise, every pause marked, every gesture specified. He was writing a kind of music, using silence and sound, movement and stillness to create meaning beyond words. Harold Pinter brought what became known as the comedy of menace to English theater, wrote plays where ordinary rooms became threatening, where characters circled each other verbally, where what wasn't said mattered more than what was. The Birthday Party presented a man hiding in a seaside boarding house, visited by 2 strangers who might be representatives of some organization or might be figments of his paranoia. They interrogated him, broke him down, took him away, and we never learned what his crime was, or if there was a crime, or if the whole thing was ritual, performance, a power game played for its own sake. The homecoming showed a family of men, a returning son bringing his wife to meet them, and over the course of an evening the family dynamic revealed itself as bizarre, threatening, the wife ultimately choosing to stay with this disturbing family, becoming their prostitute. The play never explained, never provided a psychological justification, simply presented behavior that was recognizably human even as it was alien, unsettling. Eugene O'Neill in America wrote long plays, some lasting 4 or more hours, that drew on Greek tragedy and modern psychology simultaneously. Long Day's Journey into Night was autobiographical, presented his own family, his miserly father, his drug-addicted mother, his alcoholic brother, moving through a single day and night, revealing through repetition and accumulation how they'd wounded each other, how they were trapped in patterns none of them could break. The play ended with the mother lost in morphine dreams, the men watching helplessly, knowing the next day would be the same, and the next. Tennessee Williams wrote about desire and delusion, fragile people in a harsh world. The Glass Menagerie presented his own mother and sister barely disguised. A streetcar named Desire gave American theater one of its iconic characters, Blanche Dubois, a faded Southern belle clinging to gentility, arriving at her sister's apartment in New Orleans, unable to accept that her refined pretensions had no place there, broken finally by her sister's husband, a brute who saw through her immediately, who destroyed her illusions and sent her to an asylum. Arthur Miller wrote social dramas. Death of a Salesman presented Willy Loman, an aging salesman who'd believed in the American dream, worked hard, played by the rules, and ended up with nothing, his son's failures, his career over, his mind slipping between past and present. The play showed how capitalism chewed up workers, discarded them when they were no longer useful, but it was also a family tragedy, a story about fathers and sons, about delusion and reality, about the lies we tell ourselves to keep going. The Crucible used the Salem witch trials to comment on McCarthyism, on how communities tear themselves apart through accusations and suspicion, how good people get caught up in hysteria. Miller knew this firsthand, had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, had refused to name names. The play was historical but also immediate, a reminder that the past keeps recurring, that we're always capable of persecution if we're frightened enough. These playwrights separated by centuries and continents, by language and culture and theatrical convention, nonetheless formed a kind of conversation, each one responding to predecessors, challenging assumptions, exploring new possibilities. They understood that theater was unique among art forms, that it required living bodies in shared space, that each performance was ephemeral, existing only in the moment of its occurrence. Never quite the same twice. The great plays endured because they contained multitudes, could be interpreted differently by each generation, each production. Hamlet in the 19th century was a romantic hero. In the 20th, a modern neurotic. In the 21st, perhaps something else entirely. The text remained constant, but its meanings multiplied, shifted, evolved with changing contexts, and beneath all the differences of style and subject, all the movements and manifestos, the ancient Greeks and the moderns shared certain core insights. That drama was a way of examining what it means to be human, that putting actors on a stage and having them speak could reveal truths that other forms couldn't access, that an audience watching together created a kind of community, temporary but real, bound by shared attention, shared response to what unfolded before them. The theater in my imagination grows quiet now, the voices that filled it fading into memory, into history. Aeschylus and Sophocles, Shakespeare and Molière, Ibsen and Chekhov, Beckett and Pinter, each one adding to the great conversation, each one showing us ourselves reflected back, clarified, intensified, made visible in ways we couldn't quite see without the transformation that theater provides. I think about how plays are both fixed and fluid, words on a page that only come alive when spoken, when embodied, when witnessed. A script is a kind of score, a set of instructions, but the performance is always interpretation, always collaboration between playwright and actors and director and audience, all of them necessary, none sufficient alone. The empty stage can be anywhere, anytime. A castle in Denmark, or a cherry orchard in Russia, a tenement in Brooklyn, or a boarding house by the sea. The bare space transformed by agreement, by collective imagination. Audiences suspending disbelief, accepting that these actors are those characters, that this platform is that place, entering into a contract that makes theater possible. And what we gain from this ancient art, this gathering in the dark to watch other humans pretend to be other humans, is hard to name, but unmistakable. A sense of connection, of shared experience, of recognition. We see characters facing dilemmas, making choices, suffering consequences, and we understand something about our own lives, our own possibilities, our own constraints. The great playwrights knew this, counted on it. They wrote for audiences they would never meet, in times they couldn't imagine, trusting that human nature remained constant enough, that the questions they explored would continue to resonate, that people centuries hence would still wonder about justice and love, about duty and desire, about what we owe to others and what we owe to ourselves. The plays themselves become like living things, passed down through generations, adapted, translated, reimagined, sometimes faithful to original intentions, sometimes wildly divergent, but always connecting past to present, showing that the distance between Sophocles and ourselves, between Shakespeare and now, is not as vast as chronology suggests, that the same passions, the same fears, the same hopes animate us still. I imagine actors throughout history speaking these lines, inhabiting these roles, making them new with each performance, and audiences throughout history, watching, listening, drawn into stories they knew or discovering stories for the first time. The transaction between stage and spectator unchanged despite all the changes in theater architecture, in lighting, in production values, the essential thing remaining constant, persons gathered, watching persons, seeking meaning through representation. The list of names could extend further. Luigi Pirandello exploring the boundary between reality and illusion, Garcia Lorca writing poetic tragedies about Spanish rural life, Carol Churchill experimenting with time and structure, August Wilson chronicling African-American experience across decades, Athol Fugard bearing witness to apartheid, the tradition continuing, evolving, responding to new circumstances while maintaining connection to ancient roots. But what matters most isn't the catalog of names, the chronology of movements, the history of theatrical innovation. What matters is the accumulated wisdom, the insights into human nature that these playwrights preserved, made available to anyone willing to sit in a darkened space and watch, to open themselves to the experience of seeing life distilled, concentrated, made into art that speaks across time. The candles in my imagined theater burn lower, the shadows deepen, but the stage remains, waiting for the next performance, the next interpretation, the next audience, because theater doesn't stop, doesn't conclude. It continues as long as people gather, as long as stories need telling, as long as we seek to understand ourselves through seeing ourselves reflected, transformed, made strange and familiar simultaneously. And perhaps that's the final gift of the great playwrights. They showed us that we're not alone in our struggles, our confusions, our joys, that others before us faced similar dilemmas, asked similar questions, and if they didn't always find answers, they at least found ways to articulate what it felt like to be alive, to be conscious, to be caught between desire and duty, hope and despair, self and society. The theater grows dark, the last light fading, but the words remain, waiting to be spoken again, waiting for new voices, new bodies, new audiences to discover them. And in that waiting, in that potential, the great playwrights live still. Their works not museum pieces, but living conversations, invitations to wonder, to question, to see ourselves and our world with fresh eyes, with the particular clarity that only theater, with its immediacy, its presence, its requirement of shared space and shared time, can provide